The monitors screamed. A combat veteran's heart was shutting down, and the nurse keeping him alive had her hands inside a wound that would kill him in under 4 minutes if she let go. Then a man in a tailored suit walked through the trauma bay doors, looked at the dying soldier on the table, and said 4 words that silenced the entire room. "Move him. Right now." The nurse didn't look up. Her gloves were soaked through. Her jaw tightened. "This man dies if he moves." I said, "Move him." She still didn't move, so they fired her, right there, in front of everyone, while the veteran was still bleeding. If this story grips you from the very first second, stay with me until the end. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning had started the way most Monday mornings started at Creekside Valley Medical Center. Not quietly, but with the particular kind of controlled noise that people who worked in hospitals learned to process the same way they processed breathing. Equipment carts rolling across linoleum, a PA system calling out names nobody in the hallway seemed to hear. The smell of antiseptic layered over something warmer, something harder to name, that lived in the walls of a hospital, the way weather lived in old bones. Nurse Mara Delaney was already on her second cup of coffee when she reached the trauma bay at 6:47 in the morning, 14 minutes before her shift technically began. She did that most days, not because anyone asked her to, not because she was trying to impress anyone. She did it because she'd learned, a long time ago in a place very different from this one, that 14 minutes could be the difference between someone living and someone not. Creekside Valley Medical Center sat at the edge of Harlan Falls, Colorado, a mid-sized city that called itself the gateway to the mountains on the welcome signs along the highway, though anyone who'd lived there longer than a tourist season knew the mountains were mostly backdrop. What Harlan Falls actually was a government and military corridor. 3 bases within driving distance, a VA satellite clinic on the north side. A population split between federal contractors, retirees, and a chunk of working families who'd come for the aerospace jobs and stayed because the cost of living was still manageable, barely. The hospital reflected all of that. It was big enough to matter and underfunded enough to struggle. The trauma unit saw more than its share of veterans, men and women cycling through the VA system who ended up at Creekside when things got bad enough that the satellite clinic couldn't handle it. The staff knew how to manage complex wounds, complicated medication histories, patients who didn't trust hospitals, and showed it through clenched teeth and flat refusals to answer questions. Mara was good at that part of the job, better than most. She was 33 years old, 5'6", with short brown hair. She kept pinned back on shift, and dark circles under her eyes that weren't going anywhere, regardless of how much sleep she got. She'd been at Creekside for 4 years. Before that, there was a gap in her resume that most people in HR hadn't looked at too carefully, because her nursing credentials were clean, her references were solid, and she'd passed every competency test they put in front of her without breaking a sweat. The gap was 7 years. Nobody asked what was in it. She didn't offer. She was checking supply levels in Trauma Bay 2 when the radio at the nurses' station came alive. Not the PA, the actual dispatch channel that routed through from the ambulance bay. And she heard it before the charge nurse did. Inbound. Male. 64 years old. Cardiac event plus secondary hemorrhage from a fall. On blood thinners. ETA 6 minutes. Mara put down her clipboard. "Who's on?" she called toward the station. "Kendrick's in 3. He can pivot." That was Donna Reyes, charge nurse, who had been doing this job for 22 years and communicated primarily through clipped sentences and expressions that told you everything you needed to know without using words. Right now, her expression said, "This is going to be complicated." "Get a crash cart ready in here and call down to cardiology," Mara said. "He's going to need imaging the second he's stable enough to move." "I know my job," Donna said, but she was already picking up the phone. The paramedics came through the bay doors at 6:53, and the moment Mara saw the man on the gurney, she understood why dispatch had flagged the call. He wasn't just old and hurt. He was deteriorating in real time. The gray-blue tint at his fingertips, the irregular rhythm visible in his neck even from across the room, the way his chest moved wrong on one side. She clocked all of it in about 2 seconds. "Talk to me," she said, moving alongside the gurney as they rolled. The lead paramedic, a young guy named Torres, who she recognized from previous runs, was already talking. "Raymond Gould, 64, fell down a flight of stairs at home this morning. Wife found him. He's on warfarin, has a pacemaker. Old model, possible malfunction. BP's been dropping since we picked him up. We pushed fluids, but he's not holding. Pacemaker malfunction with warfarin on board. She was pulling on fresh gloves. Any loss of consciousness? Twice. Brief. He came back both times on his own. Allergies? Wife said sulfa drugs, nothing else confirmed. Raymond Gould was conscious when they transferred him to the bay table, which was both a good sign and a problem, because conscious meant he could feel how bad things were. And Mara could see that in his face, the particular look of a person who understood something terrible was happening to their own body and had no way to stop it. "Mr. Gould," she said, her voice level close to his ear, "I'm Mara. I'm going to take care of you. I need you to stay as still as you can for me, okay? Don't fight it." He looked at her. His eyes were sharp despite everything. "Am I going to make it?" She didn't say probably, and she didn't say of course. She said, "We're working on it. Stay with me." Dr. Felix Okafor arrived 40 seconds later. Creekside's best trauma attending, a quiet man originally from Lagos who moved through emergencies the way some people move through crowded rooms, efficiently and without bumping into anything. He took one look at the monitor readout, and his expression shifted the way it did when the math wasn't adding up in his favor. "Pacemaker's firing, but not capturing," he said. "We've got a dissociation. And that rhythm," he pointed at the screen, "that's not just rate. There's something mechanical happening." "He took a hard fall," Mara said. "Could have shifted the lead." "Could have." Okafor reached past her to adjust the IV line. "Get cardiology in here now, not in 5 minutes, and I want ultrasound." Mara was already moving. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of work that didn't look impressive from the outside. No dramatic moment, no single intervention that turned everything around. It was iterative and ugly and required constant adjustment because Raymond Gould's body kept doing things they didn't fully anticipate. His blood pressure crashed twice. His pacemaker had to be overridden externally. The warfarin complicated every procedural decision because any significant bleed could be catastrophic, and the fall had almost certainly caused trauma they hadn't fully mapped yet. She moved between tasks without being told, anticipating, adjusting medication calculations in her head before Okafor asked for them out loud, keeping one eye on the monitor, one hand always in proximity to the crash cart. It wasn't graceful. She knocked over a tray at one point and didn't stop to pick it up. She argued with a cardiology fellow about medication timing in a way that was technically insubordinate and also correct. She did not explain herself until afterward, when the fellow came back and acknowledged quietly that she'd been right. By 7:40, they had Raymond Gould stable enough to move. Not stable in the way that meant he was okay, so stable in the way that meant he wasn't actively dying this minute, which was the most they could offer him before imaging and a cardiology consult. Mara stripped off her first pair of gloves and was reaching for a fresh set when Donna appeared in the bay doorway. Her expression had changed. Something had come in that Donna didn't like. "Mara," low voice. "1 second. Not 1 second. Now." She stepped out. In the corridor, Donna leaned close enough that no one nearby could hear. "There's a situation. Administration's here." "Why is administration here at 7:40 in the morning?" "Because a congressman's aide is in Bay 4 with a kidney stone, and apparently that is the most important medical event happening in this building right now." Donna's voice was flat, professionally controlled, and completely transparent about what she thought. "Bernard Holt is here." Bernard Holt was the hospital's chief operating officer. Not the CEO. That was a woman named Pamela Griggs who showed up for ribbon cuttings and quarterly reports and otherwise managed the hospital from a distance. Holt was the operational presence, the one who actually walked the halls, made the day-to-day decisions, managed the relationships that kept the hospital's political connections intact. He was 51 years old, trim, well-dressed in a way that announced it without being subtle, and he had been at Creekside for 9 years. Long enough to have built a set of allegiances and understandings that people in the building generally knew better than to challenge. Mara had dealt with him 3 times in 4 years. Each time had been brief. Each time had left her with a specific feeling she didn't have a word for, but that she recognized from other situations, other settings, involving other people who wore authority the way Holt wore it, like a coat that had been tailored to fit and that they'd never once considered taking off. She came around the corner and found him standing in the corridor outside Bay 4, where a man in his 40s was visible through the window, on a phone, not appearing to be in significant distress. Next to Holt was a woman Mara didn't recognize. Mid-30s, dark blazer, the lanyard of a government office badge tucked into a breast pocket. Holt turned when he heard her coming. "Nurse Delaney?" "Mr. Holt." "We need Bay 2. She waited a beat. "Bay 2 has a 64-year-old cardiac patient who just came out of active hemodynamic instability. We're prepping him for imaging." "I understand. We need to relocate him." The corridor was not empty. There were 2 nurses at the station 12 feet away, an orderly with a cart nearby, a physical therapist who had stopped walking and was very carefully not looking at them. "Mr. Gould can't be moved safely right now," Mara said. "His pacemaker lead is compromised. Moving him before imaging and cardiology review is a genuine risk." "I'm not asking for a medical opinion," Holt said. His voice was patient. That was the thing about him. He delivered difficult statements in a patient voice, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who should already know it. "Congressman Daley's aide requires a private room with full monitoring capability. Bay 4 isn't adequate. Bay 2 is the appropriate space. The aide has a kidney stone." "That's not relevant to this conversation." "It is relevant," Mara said, "when the alternative is moving a patient who could go back into crisis if we disturb the current setup." Holt looked at her. Not with anger, with the specific look of a person who had already made the decision and was waiting for the other person to catch up. "Dr. Okafor can determine an appropriate transfer protocol. I'm not asking you to do something unsafe. I'm asking you to coordinate the transition." "Dr. Okafor is with the patient. Then I'll speak with him." "He'll tell you the same thing." The patient voice disappeared. Not entirely. Holt had too much practice for that. But it shifted. A fraction. Enough that the nurses at the station had gone very still. "Nurse Delaney, I am instructing you to initiate transfer protocols for the patient in Bay 2. That is a directive. If you have concerns about patient safety, you can document them after the fact." After the fact. Mara looked at him. The orderly near the cart had stopped moving. She was aware, in the peripheral way she'd been trained to be aware, of every person in that corridor, who was watching, who was pretending not to, where each of them was positioned. "No," she said. The word sat there. Holt's jaw shifted. "I'm sorry? I'm not initiating transfer. Not until Dr. Okafor has cleared it, cardiology has reviewed, and we have imaging. That's the medical standard. I'm not moving a compromised cardiac patient to clear a room for a kidney stone." The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which in a hospital corridor is a long time. "You're refusing a direct administrative instruction. I'm refusing to put a patient in danger." Holt straightened. He was not a physically imposing man, but he had the posture of someone accustomed to things going the way he expected them to go, and that posture did something in the moment, made the space around him feel smaller, more pressured. "Your employment with Creekside Valley Medical Center is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You are to leave the floor without entering any patient area." Somewhere behind her, she heard a sharp intake of breath. She didn't look back to find out who it was. "You're going to fire me here," she said, "in the middle of a corridor, while my patient is in active instability. My decision stands." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she looked past him at the aide visible through the window of Bay 4, still on his phone, looking healthy and mildly bored, then back at Holt. "Document it," she said. "Every word. I'll be filing my own report." She stepped back, turned toward the nurse's station to pick up her personal badge and the small notepad she kept in her breast pocket because she'd learned long ago to take her own notes. Donna was standing at the station, and her face was completely still in the way faces got when a person was containing something with significant effort. "Donna," Mara said quietly, leaning in, "don't let them move him until Okafor signs off, whatever they say." "Okafor's signature." "I know," Donna said. Her voice was very quiet. "I know that." Mara nodded once, straightened, walked toward the bay exit without running, without looking back, without giving Bernard Holt the satisfaction of seeing anything on her face that he could later describe as emotional or erratic. In the waiting area at the end of the corridor, past the double doors, a handful of people sat in plastic chairs. Family members, a couple of people who looked like they'd been there since the previous night, a man in his late 50s in civilian clothes, who'd been sitting in the third row from the window for the past hour. He'd been there when the paramedics came in with Raymond Gould. He was still there now. His name was not on any badge. He hadn't checked in at the desk. He was the kind of person who could sit in a waiting room without drawing attention. Not because he was forgettable, exactly, but because he carried himself with the particular calibrated stillness of someone who'd spent years being in places where being noticed was a liability. His name was Daniel Rourke, retired, or that was the word he used when people asked. He watched Mara come through the double doors, watched the set of her shoulders, the control in her stride, the way her hands had stopped moving the way they moved when she was working and had closed into something quieter at her sides. He pulled out a phone, opened a contact. Didn't dial yet. Just watched. Back inside the trauma bay, two things happened almost simultaneously, 6 minutes after Mara was removed from the floor. The first was that Raymond Gould's monitor alarmed. Not the soft escalation alarm that signaled a measurement out of range. The hard, continuous alarm that meant something structural had shifted. The second was that Bernard Holt walked into the bay with a hospital orderly and told the nurse on rotation, a third-year named Preston Mays who had been at Creekside for 8 months and had never once been in a room with an administrator while a patient coded, to begin transfer preparation. Preston looked at the monitor, looked at Holt, looked back at the monitor. The alarm just, "Is Dr. Okafor here?" He stepped out to make a call. He'll be right. Begin the assessment for transfer. Sir, I think... The alarm changed pitch. Preston went to the monitor. His hands moved fast, and he was competent. He genuinely was. But he was also 29 months out of nursing school, and Raymond Gould's situation required a specific kind of expertise that couldn't be compressed. He called out to the corridor. He reached for the crash cart. The code response arrived in 90 seconds, which is technically fast and was not fast enough for what was happening to Raymond Gould's heart. Holt had stepped back against the wall, out of the way, which was the correct physical move and which did not prevent him from being present for all of it. What stopped the deterioration was not the crash team, who arrived trained and ready and still half a beat behind the rhythm of what was happening. What stopped it was the door opening. Mara came through the door of Trauma Bay 2 with her badge around her neck and her gloves already on. She had heard the monitor change through the double doors. She had heard it from the waiting area, from 30 feet away and through a wall, and something in her had registered the pitch shift the way you might register your own name being called in a crowded room. Automatic, physical, not a decision. "He's dissociating again," she said as she moved, not explaining herself to anyone in the room, not acknowledging Holt at the wall, not pausing. "Preston, get off the cart. Get me the pacer output." "You were terminated," Holt said from the wall. "Document it," she said, the same words she'd said in the corridor, the same tone, and she was already at the bedside. What she did over the next 11 minutes was not dramatic in the way emergency medicine looks dramatic in television or movies. There was no single heroic action. There was instead an accumulation of correct decisions made in rapid succession, each one built on information she processed faster than the people around her because she had been in situations, genuinely, historically, in a way that no one in that room knew about, in which the margin for error was measured in seconds, and there was no backup, and the person who died if you got it wrong was someone you knew by name. She adjusted the pacing threshold by hand. She caught a medication interaction that the crash team hadn't flagged because it required cross-referencing Raymond Gould's warfarin history with the emergency drug that had just been pushed, and she caught it in time, and she called it out in a flat voice that made the administering nurse stop with the syringe still in hand. She talked to Raymond Gould the entire time. Not to calm him, he was semi-conscious and beyond calming, but because she had found, a long time ago, that people in crisis respond to a voice that expects them to hold on, and that sometimes that expectation does something physiologically that couldn't be explained cleanly, but that she had seen work too many times to dismiss. "Stay with me, Mr. Gould, still working. Don't let go yet." At the 11-minute mark, Raymond Gould's rhythm stabilized. Not perfectly. There was still the underlying structural problem with the pacemaker lead, still the anticoagulation issue, still the unread imaging. But the acute event had passed. He was no longer in immediate danger of dying in the next 60 seconds. Mara stepped back from the bedside, pulled off the top layer of gloves. Her hands were steady. Felix Okafor came through the door 30 seconds later, back from his phone call, and took in the room in about 2 seconds. The crash cart, the positioning, the monitors, Mara standing at the bedside. And his face did something complicated that resolved into a professional expression by the time he reached her. "Report," he said. She gave it to him in 40 seconds. Clean, precise. What had happened, what she'd done, what the current status was. He nodded. "Good catch on the interaction. It's in his chart, the warfarin history." "I know." He looked at her, then looked at Holt, who was still at the wall, who had not moved or spoken since Mara came back through the door. "I'm going to need to speak with administration." "I imagine so," Mara said. She peeled off her second pair of gloves and dropped them in the waste bin, straightened her scrub top. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms got quiet after a crisis. Not peaceful, but emptied out, like the air itself had used something up. Raymond Gould's eyes were open. He found her face. "Still here," she said. His hand moved fractionally toward hers. She let him take her fingers for a moment, just a moment. Then she stepped back. Because there was still work to do, and she had always understood, in a way that was bone deep and not sentimental, that the work didn't wait for how you felt about it. In the corridor outside, Donna Reyes was on the phone. Her voice was low, and her posture had the straight-line quality it got when she was extremely focused. Preston Mays was at the nurses' station filling out an incident report with the handwriting of someone who was slightly shaking and trying not to show it. 2 nurses from the morning shift had gathered near the supply room and were talking in hushed voices that stopped when a hospital security guard walked past. The security guard had been sent to the floor by Bernard Holt 22 minutes ago to escort Mara from the building. He had arrived at the trauma bay door in time to see her standing at Raymond Gould's bedside, keeping him alive. He had not said anything. He was still standing in the corridor, technically on assignment, not sure what his next move was supposed to be. In the waiting room at the end of the hall, Daniel Rourke was no longer sitting down. He was at the window and he had his phone to his ear now, and he was speaking in the quiet, unhurried way of someone delivering specific information to a specific person who would know exactly what to do with it. "You need to run a full background on a COO named Bernard Holt," he said. "Creekside Valley Medical Center, Harlan Falls, Colorado." A pause. "And I need everything you can pull on a nurse named Mara Delaney. Because whoever she is, she's not just a nurse." He watched through the glass as the security guard outside the trauma bay looked down at his radio, then back at the door, then back at his radio again. "No," Rourke said into the phone. "I'll stay here. I want to see how this plays out." He put the phone in his pocket. On the other side of the glass, the monitor above Raymond Gould's bed continued its steady rhythm. Not perfect, not resolved, but present, which was everything. Outside the window of the waiting room, the mountains of Colorado rose pale and enormous against a sky that had gone from gray to gold in the time since all of this started, and the city of Harlan Falls was waking up, and not a single person in it yet understood what the morning had just set in motion. The mountains didn't care what had happened in Trauma Bay 2. They sat where they'd always sat, pale and indifferent above the rooftops of Harlan Falls. And the city kept moving underneath them the way cities always did. Buses pulling out of depots, coffee shops opening their doors, the particular noise of a morning that didn't know it was supposed to be significant. Daniel Rourke stood at the waiting room window for another 4 minutes after he ended the call. He wasn't looking at the mountains. He was watching the reflection in the glass, the security guard in the corridor who still hadn't made a decision, the nurses at the station whose body language told him everything he needed to know about the mood on that floor, the door to Trauma Bay 2 that hadn't opened again. Then he sat back down, folded his hands across his knee, and waited. Because waiting was something he had done professionally for the better part of 2 decades, and he was not bad at it. His name was not in any hospital database. He hadn't signed in because the woman at the front desk hadn't been there when he arrived at 6:15, and he'd walked past the unmanned station without breaking stride, which was habit. He was in Harlan Falls because his brother-in-law had had a hip replacement at Creekside Valley 2 weeks ago, and Rourke had driven down from Denver to check in, the way you did when family asked and you were between things. He'd planned to be there an hour, maybe 2. That was before the paramedics came through the bay doors with Raymond Gould, and before he'd watched a nurse get fired in a hospital corridor while her patient was actively dying. What he'd seen in those 40 minutes, not just what happened, but how she moved, how she talked, The things she did with the medication interaction that a trauma-experienced nurse might catch, and a combat-experienced medic would catch faster, had triggered something in him that was less intuition and more pattern recognition. He'd spent enough years around enough people with specific skill sets to know when he was looking at one. The person he'd called was a woman named Gail Hendricks, who worked for a federal oversight office and who owed him a favor that had been sitting uncollected for 3 years. He'd asked for 2 things: a background on Bernard Holt and whatever she could find on Mara Delaney. He expected to wait a few hours. He was wrong about that. What? Inside the trauma bay, the handoff between Mara and the incoming cardiology team took 20 minutes that felt longer because of who was in the room. Felix Okafor managed it with the same economy of motion he brought to everything: directing, documenting, keeping the clinical work separated from the institutional disaster that was currently developing around it like weather. He was good at that. Most of the good ones were. Bernard Holt had left the bay. Not quickly. He wasn't the type to flee a room. It would have looked like something he didn't want to look like, but purposefully, as if he had somewhere more important to be, which was the version of retreat that men in his position had perfected. He was in his office on the 4th floor by the time the cardiology fellow finished his preliminary assessment of Raymond Gould, and he was on the phone before he'd fully sat down. The person he called was his direct supervisor, which was the correct move procedurally, but Holt's direct supervisor in this context was not a neutral party. Creekside Valley's CEO, Pamela Griggs, had built the hospital's political reputation on a specific set of relationships, and Congressman Warren Daly's office was among the most important of those relationships. The congressman's infrastructure funding votes had been good to the hospital over the past 6 years. The hospital had been good to the congressman in ways that were more difficult to put in writing. The aide with the kidney stone was named Curtis Fenn. He was 38, moderately high up in Daly's office, and the kind of person who expected a certain standard of treatment in institutional settings because he'd learned he could expect it. He was not by any serious measure in medical danger. The kidney stone was painful and would pass. He had already told 2 nurses and a physician's assistant that he hoped the situation would be resolved quickly because he had calls at 9. None of this was Raymond Gould's fault or Mara's fault, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that the sequence of events that began with Curtis Fenn's arrival at the hospital had now resulted in a terminated nurse returning to a patient floor to override an administrative directive, which, regardless of the clinical outcome, was a situation that Holt needed to control before it became a situation that someone else controlled for him. He told Griggs the same version of events he intended to tell everyone. Nurse Delaney had refused a reasonable administrative instruction, had been formally terminated, and had then violated hospital policy by returning to the floor and inserting herself into a clinical situation without authorization. The patient outcome was fortunate. The behavior was not acceptable. Griggs listened, asked 3 questions: whether it had been witnessed, whether there was documentation, and whether the patient was stable. Holt said yes, yes, and yes. "Then manage it," she said. "I don't want this becoming a story." She meant a news story. Holt understood that. He was already thinking about it. Donna Reyes had worked in hospital nursing for 22 years, which meant she had developed the specific survival skill of knowing when to speak and when to write things down instead, because written things had a different quality than spoken things in institutional disputes. They existed. They had timestamps. They were harder to retroactively characterize as misunderstandings. By 9 o'clock, she had filed 3 separate incident reports. The first documented her direct observation of Raymond Gould's instability at the time Holt had ordered the room cleared. The second documented Preston May's account of the deterioration event, which Preston had given her verbatim because she'd asked him to talk while she typed, and which captured the timing with enough specificity that no one could later claim Gould had already been stable. The third documented the medication interaction that Mara had caught, including the specific drug combination and the timeline. She filed them through the hospital's formal reporting system, which meant they were time-stamped and routed to quality assurance and the nursing director and 3 other departments, and which also meant that Bernard Holt could not make them disappear without involving more people than he probably wanted to involve. She did not call Mara, not because she didn't want to, but because she was aware that any communication between them right now would be examined, and she needed to make sure that what she documented stood on its own before anyone could characterize it as coordinated. What she did do, at 9:14, was take her lunch break on the hospital's second-floor terrace, where the signal was good, and call a woman named Patricia Odom, who was a patient advocate and part-time paralegal, and who had, 3 years ago, helped a Creekside nurse navigate a wrongful termination case that had eventually settled out of the public eye. "Tell me the situation," Patricia said. Donna told her. The line was quiet for a moment. "She needs to get in front of someone today, before the hospital has time to build the paperwork." "I know. Does she know that?" "I don't know what she knows right now," Donna said. "I know she walked out of that bay about an hour ago, and she looked like someone who had just finished diffusing something and was still working out what came next." "Can you reach her?" "Not from here. Not now." "Okay." Patricia's voice had shifted to the tone it got when she was already moving forward. "Get me the incident report numbers when you can. And Donna, don't talk to HR. Not yet. If they call you in, you ask for a union rep first." "I'm not in the union." "Then you ask for time to consult with personal counsel. It doesn't matter if you have one. Just by the clock." Mara was in her car in the hospital parking structure on level 2 when her phone rang. She'd been sitting there for 31 minutes. The car was off. She hadn't cried because she wasn't particularly close to crying. What she felt was more like the specific suspended state that came after a sustained period of high function, when the body understood the adrenaline was metabolizing and didn't quite know what to replace it with. She'd been thinking about Raymond Gould, about whether the cardiology team would catch everything, about whether the pacemaker lead was going to require emergency surgery or whether they'd manage it conservatively, about the medication interaction she'd flagged and whether it was fully documented. She was not thinking about her employment status, which she knew was not a rational prioritization, but which she couldn't entirely help. The number on her phone was unfamiliar. She answered anyway. "Mara Delaney," a woman's voice said. Not a question. "Who is this?" "Patricia Odom. I'm a patient advocate and legal consultant. I've been speaking with a colleague of yours. I won't say who for now. I understand you had a difficult morning." Mara looked at the concrete pillar in front of her car. "You could describe it that way. I'd like to help you if you're open to it, but I need to ask you some questions first, and I need you to be honest with me, including about the parts that might be uncomfortable." "Go ahead." Patricia's questions were methodical and specific. She asked about the sequence of events in the corridor. Who said what, in what order, who was present. She asked about Mara's return to the trauma bay and whether anyone had physically barred her from re-entering, and whether there had been any verbal exchange with Holt at that point. She asked about the medication interaction. When she asked why Mara had gone back in, Mara was quiet for a moment. "I heard the monitor change," she said, "from the waiting area." "Yes." Another pause from Patricia. "That's unusual." "I know." "Were you a patient care coordinator before?" "ICU?" Something that would explain, "I was a nurse before," Mara said carefully. "I've worked in high acuity environments." She could feel Patricia letting that sit, not pushing. Professional instinct. "Okay. I think you have a very strong wrongful termination case. The sequence of events, the patient outcome, the witnesses, it's documented well enough that most attorneys would want to take this. The issue is going to be timing and optics. The hospital is going to move fast to characterize your return to the floor as a policy violation. They need that framing to hold up, so they'll build it before you have a chance to establish your version. What do I do? Do you have copies of anything, your own notes, anything you documented? Mara thought about the notepad she'd retrieved from the nurse's station before leaving the floor. Some. Good. Don't share them with anyone yet. And I mean anyone. Not colleagues, not friends, not family. Just hold them. A brief pause. And I need to know something else. Is there anything in your background that they could use? Anything complicated? The parking structure was very quiet. Somewhere 2 levels below, a car started. There might be, Mara said. Much. What Gail Hendricks sent Daniel Rourke at 11:47 that morning was not a complete file. It was a fragment, the kind of partial disclosure that a federal employee could pull together in a few hours without triggering the formal access request that left records. It was enough. Mara Delaney, 33 years old, Colorado nursing license obtained 4 years ago. prior address history thin, almost artificially thin, the kind of thin that suggested either very deliberate record management or a name change, or both. No criminal history, no malpractice filings, clean. The gap in the record, the 7 years before the nursing license, contained almost nothing, a few database ghosts, a social security number that surfaced twice in federal payroll records during that period and then went quiet. The payroll records were linked to a contractor ID, not a direct government employer, which could mean a dozen different things. Gail's note at the bottom said, "She's not hiding from law enforcement. Whatever she is, it's the other kind of classified. I can go deeper, but it'll take longer and leave traces." "Your call." Rourke read it twice. Then he looked at what she'd sent on Holt. Bernard Holt's file was much thicker because Bernard Holt was not careful in the ways that mattered. He was careful in the ways that were visible. His public profile was clean. His hospital record was formally unblemished. His relationship with Creekside's board was well maintained. But Gail had found 3 things in the financial threads that were interesting. The first was a procurement contract from 2 years ago between Creekside Valley and a medical supply company called Meridian Health Solutions, worth approximately $4.2 million over 3 years. Standard contract, except that Meridian's board of directors included a name that appeared in a second context Gail had found, a political fundraising entity connected to Congressman Warren Daly's office. The second was that the Meridian contract had been renewed 6 months ago at an 18% cost increase with no competitive bidding based on an administrative determination signed by Bernard Holt. The third was that Holt's personal financial disclosures, which were available because he served on a state hospital advisory board that required them, showed a consulting fee income stream from a company called BH Advisory Services, LLC, which Holt himself had incorporated, that had received payments from 3 medical supply vendors in the past 4 years. One of those vendors was Meridian. None of this was necessarily proof of anything. Circumstantial threads always look different when you pulled on them. Sometimes they unraveled something real. Sometimes they just unraveled. But the pattern had a shape that Rourke recognized, not from any specific previous case, but from the texture of how these things worked when they were working. The way corruption in institutional settings almost always involved procurement and almost always involved political cover. He sent Gail one message: "Go deeper. Leave as few traces as you can. I'll cover anything that comes back to you." Then he drove to the hospital cafeteria, bought coffee he didn't particularly want, and used the hospital's public Wi-Fi to do his own searching, because some threads didn't require federal database access. They just required patience and the right keywords. Mara did not go home. She drove to a diner on the east side of Harlan Falls that she'd been going to for 4 years, not because the food was exceptional, but because the corner booth in the back had a window with a view of the parking lot, and the staff had stopped asking her questions after the 3rd or 4th time she'd come in alone and sat for 2 hours with a notebook and a cup of coffee. She ordered eggs she didn't eat and drank the coffee and wrote down everything she remembered in the sequence it happened, which took 40 minutes and filled 11 pages of the small-line notebook she kept in her bag. She was not panicking. That was one thing she could say about herself, though she was not sure it was entirely a virtue. Her capacity to not panic in acute situations came from having been in situations where panic was a death sentence, and the same mechanism that had kept her functional in those situations now kept her sitting in a diner booth writing notes with the methodical calm of someone filling out a form, while her career was being dismantled 4 miles away. She wrote the time codes as precisely as she could remember them, the exact words Holt had used, the names of everyone present in the corridor, what she'd observed when she came back through the double doors, what the monitor had shown, what medications had been in the line and in what order. She was writing the section on the medication interaction when her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She was going to let it go to voicemail and then didn't. Ms. Delaney. Male voice, older. Not from a government office. She could tell from the background ambiance, which sounded like a cafeteria. "My name is Daniel Rourke. I was in the waiting room at Creekside Valley this morning." She held the phone very still. "How did you get this number?" "I have some facility with that kind of thing. I'm not trying to alarm you. I want to tell you what I saw and then let you decide if you want to continue the conversation." "Go ahead." He told her, concisely, in the direct way of someone who'd learned to deliver information without editorializing, what he'd observed from the waiting room, what he'd seen when the paramedics arrived, what happened in the corridor, and what he'd seen through the glass when she went back into the bay. He didn't describe her as heroic. He just described what he'd observed. That was how she knew to keep listening. "Why are you calling me?" she asked when he finished. "Because I think what happened to you this morning is part of something bigger. And I think you probably know that. And I think you're currently sitting somewhere writing down everything you remember." A beat of silence. "What do you do, Mr. Rourke?" "Retired federal," he said. "Various flavors." "That's vague." "By design, but relevant." He paused. "I've been looking at your COO. There are procurement threads that someone should be pulling. I don't know yet how far they go. And you think that has something to do with this morning?" "I think men like Bernard Holt don't take the risk of publicly firing a nurse in a trauma corridor unless they're used to operating in an environment where that kind of thing doesn't come back to them. That kind of confidence comes from structure, and structure usually has money in it." She looked at her notebook, at the 11 pages of careful, precise documentation. "I'm going to need some time to think about this," she said. "Take it, but not too much. The hospital is building their version of this right now." She already knew that. "What are you getting out of this?" A pause that was different from his other pauses. Not calculating, more like he was deciding how honest to be. "I saw something this morning that I don't see very often, and I've been in enough situations to know that what I saw doesn't end well for the person who has it unless someone's paying attention. I'd like to pay attention." "That's still not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." Another pause. "I think you served. I think you served somewhere and in some capacity that most people don't know about, and I think that's part of what they're going to use against you." The diner was warm. Outside the window, a couple was loading groceries into a car with the slow, domestic ease of people who had nowhere urgent to be. A normal Tuesday morning in Harlan Falls. "Don't contact me again on this number," Mara said. "If I decide to continue this conversation, I'll reach out." She ended the call, sat for a long moment, then turned to a new page in the notebook and wrote 2 words at the top: Meridian Health. Chint. At 1:17 in the afternoon, Mara received an official termination letter by email from Creekside Valley Human Resources. It cited insubordination, violation of administrative directives, and unauthorized re-entry to a restricted patient care area after employment separation. It was formally worded, procedurally clean, and had clearly been reviewed by legal counsel before it was sent, which told her that someone at that hospital had moved very fast. Attached to the termination letter was a second document, a formal performance documentation notice, backdated, not criminally, not by more than a few months, but backdated, that cited 2 prior incidents of behavioral concerns during Mara's employment. She read both of them. One was a supervisor note about a communication issue with a physician that she remembered completely differently and that had never once been raised formally during her 4 years at Creekside. The other referenced an incident that she had no memory of at all and that included documentation she'd never been shown. She photographed both documents with her phone before closing the email. Patricia Odom, when Mara called her back at 1:30, heard the details and was quiet for approximately 10 seconds. "The backdating is sloppy," Patricia said. "If it's real documentation, it should have been in your personnel file, and you should have been formally notified at the time. If you weren't, I wasn't. Then that's fabricated documentation, which is a very different conversation from wrongful termination." Another pause. "This just became a legal matter, not just an HR matter." "I know. I need you to come in, today. I'll be there at 3. She was there at 2:45. Patricia Odom turned out to be a short, compact woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the specific kind of organized desk that meant its owner processed an enormous amount of paper on a daily basis. She read everything Mara had: the termination letter, the backdated documentation, the notes from the notebook that Mara dictated rather than hand over, because she was still operating on the instinct that she should hold certain things in reserve. When Mara finished talking, Patricia took off her glasses and set them on the desk. "There's something I need to ask you, and I need you to understand I'm asking as your advocate, not as a judgment." "Go ahead." "The incident from your file, the one you don't recognize, is there any possibility it refers to something real that was simply documented incorrectly or categorized incorrectly?" Mara considered that. "No." "You're certain?" I have a good memory for incidents that could have had clinical consequences. That one didn't happen. Patricia nodded slowly. Then someone at that hospital built false documentation against you in under 6 hours, which means they were motivated, and they had access, and they were worried enough to take that risk. She leaned forward. What are they worried you'll say? That was the right question. Mara looked at the edge of Patricia's desk and thought about Raymond Gould's monitors and Bernard Holt's patient voice and the aide in Bay 4 on his phone. And she thought about a procurement contract in a company called Meridian Health and a number she'd written at the top of a clean notebook page. I think, she said, that this morning wasn't an isolated incident. Tell me what you mean. I think the reason a hospital COO was on the trauma floor at 7 in the morning, personally directing patient relocation to accommodate a congressional aide, isn't simply about political relationships. I think there's a financial component. And I think that whatever that component is, it requires the kind of operational control that makes someone like Holt feel confident enough to fire a nurse in a public corridor because she got in the way of it. Patricia was very still. Do you have anything to support that? Not yet. A name, the beginning of a thread. Don't pull on it yourself, Patricia said immediately. Whatever you're thinking, don't. If there is a financial dimension to this, and if it connects to political relationships, that is not territory you investigate as a private citizen. That is territory that requires people with specific authorities. Mara thought about a phone call she'd ended in a diner booth. I understand, she said. 1. The thread started by Daniel Rourke that morning had, by 4 o'clock, reached a woman named Celia Marsh in the Denver field office of the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. Rourke hadn't called her directly. The chain had 2 intermediaries, but the information reached her with enough specificity that she pulled up the Meridian Health Solutions contract file herself and spent 40 minutes reading it before she called her supervisor. What she found was not new information exactly. The contract existed in the federal database, the renewal existed, the documentation was technically complete. But when she looked at it with the context Rourke's information had provided, she found 3 things she hadn't been looking for. The competitive bidding exemption on the renewal was signed under an administrative exception category that applied to continuity of care situations. Creekside Valley was a federally funded facility, which meant federal procurement guidelines applied. The continuity of care exception was real, but it required documentation of specific clinical dependencies that Meridian's products were uniquely suited to serve. That documentation was in the file. But when she cross-referenced the equipment specifications against the manufacturer data, the specifications had been written in a way that was technically accurate and practically constructed to exclude all of Meridian's direct competitors. It was not the clumsiest thing she'd ever seen, but it was not subtle either. She told her supervisor she needed to open a preliminary inquiry. He told her to put it in writing. She was doing that when her phone rang, and it was the second intermediary in the Rourke chain calling with one additional piece of information that hadn't been in the first message. The piece of information was a name, not Holt's name, a different name, a name that appeared in Meridian Health's financial filings in a role that was described as senior advisory and that matched a name in the political contribution records of Congressman Warren Daly's most recent re-election campaign. The name was Leonard Voss, and Leonard Voss, according to 3 separate database entries, was also currently serving on the board of the Colorado State Medical Licensing Authority. Celia Marsh read that 3 times. Then she made a second call to her supervisor. I need more than a preliminary inquiry, she said. I need a proper file. Mara didn't know any of this yet. What she knew, at 5:30 in the afternoon, was that she was sitting in her apartment with her notebook and her phone and a glass of water, and that her hands had finally stopped being steady in the way they'd been steady all day. Not shaking exactly, but slightly loose at the joints in the way they sometimes got after a long stretch of sustained concentration. She was thinking about what Patricia had said. Don't pull on it yourself. And she was thinking about the call from Rourke. And she was thinking about Raymond Gould. And she was thinking about a lot of other things that lived in the 7 years of her life that her official record didn't mention. Her phone rang. She checked the screen. Number she didn't recognize, different from Rourke's. She answered. Ms. Delaney. A woman's voice. Careful, specific, official, in a way that was different from HR official or legal official. Government official. My name is Celia Marsh. I work for the Federal Office of Inspector General. I'm sorry to call this late. I understand you've had a significant day. Mara sat very still. I have some questions about Creekside Valley Medical Center, Marsh continued, specifically about their procurement relationships. I want to be transparent. I'm not calling you as a subject. I'm calling you as a potential witness. And I want to be equally transparent that I've been receiving information today from various channels, and your name has come up in a context that suggests you may have observed things that are relevant to what we're beginning to look at. How long have you been looking at this? As of today, 4 hours, which I recognize is very recent. But some things, when you see the shape of them, you don't wait on. A brief pause. Can we meet tomorrow morning? Outside Mara's window, the streetlights had come on. 2 floors below, her neighbor was walking a dog that was pulling toward a fire hydrant with the focused intensity of an animal that had a clear purpose and no complications. She thought about Bernard Holt's patient voice saying you can document your concerns after the fact. She thought about Raymond Gould's hand finding hers. Yes, she said, we can meet. 8 o'clock. I'll send you an address. One question before we hang up. Go ahead. The thing you're looking at, how big is it? The line was quiet long enough that Mara thought the call might have dropped. Ms. Delaney, Marsh said finally, and her voice had changed in a small but definite way, the way voices changed when a person was setting aside professional caution for exactly one sentence. I think it's big enough that you and I are going to have a long conversation tomorrow, and I think there may be people who realize that by morning. The call ended. Mara set her phone face down on the table, looked at the window, looked at the glass of water, reached for her notebook and wrote down the time, the name, and one line beneath it. They already know I saw. 3 miles away, in a glass-walled office on the 4th floor of Creekside Valley Medical Center, Bernard Holt was ending a phone call of his own. His face, when he set the phone down, had the look of a man who had just learned that the situation had acquired dimensions he hadn't accounted for. He sat at his desk for a long moment. Then he picked the phone back up and dialed a number that was not in his contact list, a number he'd memorized, because writing it down anywhere was exactly the kind of thing you didn't do. The line rang 4 times before it picked up. We have a problem, Holt said. The voice on the other end said nothing for a moment. How big? It asked, and Holt, who had spent 9 years at Creekside managing problems before they became stories, who had signed contracts and written exemptions and maintained relationships with the particular care of someone who understood that the machinery only worked as long as every part kept moving, looked at his desk and thought about a federal area code on a caller ID readout that one of his staff had reported seeing on Mara Delaney's phone records, obtained in a way that was, itself, a problem, and said the only honest thing he'd said all day. Bigger than this morning, he said. Bigger than I thought. The voice on the other end of Holt's phone belonged to a man named Leonard Voss, and Leonard Voss did not panic. That was the thing about him, the quality that had made him useful to a certain kind of arrangement for the better part of a decade. He processed information the way a machine processed it, without the interference of immediate emotion, and then he made decisions that were efficient and sometimes cruel and always oriented toward one thing, containment. Tell me exactly what you know, Voss said. Holt told him. The OIG area code on Delaney's phone, the call duration, 4 minutes, which was long enough to be substantive. The fact that it had come the same day as the termination, which meant someone had moved faster than either of them had anticipated. Who gave you her call records? One of my admin staff has a contact in the carrier's compliance office. A pause. That's a felony, Bernard. I know what it is. Then you understand that if that surfaces, we don't defend it. You were never told. Voss's voice was flat, precise. A man drawing perimeters. Who else at the hospital knows what happened this morning? The charge nurse. She filed incident reports before I could get ahead of it. And Okafor, he's going to be a problem. He doesn't like me, and he's going to document everything clinically. The charge nurse's name. Donna Reyes. And the reports, are they in the hospital system? Yes. Time-stamped. Routed to QA. Another pause, longer this time. I need to think about this overnight. Don't contact Griggs again. Don't make any more moves on Delaney's file. Whatever documentation your HR team has already sent, that's done. Let it stand, but nothing else moves without my input. Are we clear? We're clear.
And Bernard, the voice shifted slightly, not warmer, just more precise. The OIG doesn't open a file in 4 hours unless they already had a thread. This wasn't just today. Understand what that means.
Holt understood.
He sat with the phone in his hand for a while after the call-in ended, looking at his desk, at the hospital at night through his office window. The lit corridors, the nurses moving in and out of rooms, the ordinary machinery of a medical institution running its overnight shift. He had spent 9 years building something in this place. 9 years of relationships and contracts and understandings,
Of making himself indispensable to people who needed things done without wanting to know how they were done. He had always known, in an abstract way, that there was a version of this that ended badly. Most people who operated the way he operated knew that. You accounted for it, and you managed it, and you made sure that the people above you in the structure were more exposed than you were, because the only real protection was being less useful as a fall than as an asset. What he had not accounted for was a nurse who could hear a cardiac monitor change pitch from 30 feet away through a wall. Mara was at the Federal Field Office on Glenmore Avenue at 7:53, 7 minutes early, because she had not slept well and had spent the last 40 minutes of the night lying in the dark, running through procedural sequences. What to say, what to hold back, how to frame what she knew versus what she'd inferred, where the line was between being helpful and being naive. Celia Marsh turned out to be younger than her phone voice suggested. Early 40s, a quick, precise energy. The kind of person who carried a legal pad even when she had a laptop because some people still thought faster by hand. She had 2 colleagues with her, a man named Foster, who was from the OIG's Financial Crimes Unit, and a woman named Dr. Iris Tanaka, who was introduced only as a consultant, which told Mara nothing and therefore told her something. They met in a room that was deliberately ordinary. A conference table, chairs, a window with a view of a parking structure. No recording equipment visible, which meant either there was no recording or the recording equipment was not visible. Marsh laid out the parameters before she asked a single question. You are here as a witness, not a subject. This is a voluntary interview. You can stop at any time. You should know that the investigation we are conducting, and I want to be accurate with you, so I'll say preliminary inquiry rather than full investigation, because that's where we are right now. Concerns potential procurement fraud and related financial misconduct at Creekside Valley Medical Center. What happened to you yesterday is a thread that may connect to that, but it is not the center of it. What is the center of it? Mara asked. Marsh glanced at Foster. Something passed between them that was a decision. Meridian Health Solutions, she said, and the relationships around it. Mara kept her face neutral. I've heard that name. Tell me what you've heard and where you heard it. Mara told her about the call from Rourke, not what she'd inferred, just what he'd said, what he'd named. She was careful about it in the way she was careful about most things, giving information that was factual without giving away the analytical work she'd done with it. Marsh listened without writing anything down, which meant she already had most of it. When Mara finished, Marsh said, Mr. Rourke is a known source. He's credible. I'm not going to ask you what else he told you. She clicked her pen. I want to ask you about yesterday morning, not the termination specifically, the patient, Raymond Gould. What about him? How did you know him? The question surprised her. I didn't. He was an inbound call from dispatch. You'd never treated him before? Never seen him in the facility? No? Are you certain? Yes, I'd remember him. Marsh wrote something. Mr. Gould is a veteran, retired Army. He served in a logistics and communications capacity for a significant portion of his service, but his final 3 years before retirement were spent attached to a unit that worked closely with federal oversight and military audit functions. She let that sit for a moment. He filed a complaint 14 months ago against Creekside Valley Medical Center through the VA's patient advocacy system, specifically regarding his treatment during a prior admission, billing irregularities, and a concern that his care decisions were being influenced by administrative priorities rather than clinical ones. The room was very quiet. The complaint was reviewed, Marsh continued, and closed without finding. The person who reviewed and closed it at the VA's regional level was a staff member who has since left the agency and whose departure record indicates he received a consulting contract 2 months after his last day. The contracting entity was a subsidiary of Meridian Health Solutions. Mara looked at the table, at her own hands on the table. He wasn't just a random patient. No, he was not. Marcia's voice was even. Which means, what happened to him yesterday morning? The decision to clear his room, the deterioration during that attempted transfer, the sequence of events leading to your termination, none of that happened in a vacuum. Someone knew who he was. Someone may have known he had a prior complaint. The weight of that settled in the room the way weight settled. Not dramatically, just completely. Was it deliberate? Mara asked. What happened to him? We don't know yet. It may have been opportunistic. The aide's arrival may have genuinely triggered a room-clearing decision that was about political accommodation and not about Gould specifically. Or Gould's name may have flagged something in a system that someone was watching. Marsh set down her pen. Either way, you were in that room, and whatever you did in that room was the reason he's alive to be a witness. Foster, who had not spoken yet, said from the end of the table, "How did you catch the medication interaction?" Mara looked at him. Cross-referencing his warfarin history with the emergency formulary, standard practice. In under 40 seconds? I've worked fast before. Foster didn't push it, but he wrote something, and his face had the expression of someone who had noted something he intended to return to. Across town, in a conference room at Creekside Valley, Bernard Holt was meeting with the hospital's legal counsel, a firm called Ashworth & Dale that handled institutional liability for several large healthcare systems in the state. The lead attorney was a man named Gregory Ashworth himself, mid-50s, the kind of lawyer who wore his suits the way people wore armor and who spoke with the deliberate pace of someone who charged by the word and knew it. Ashworth had read everything by 7 o'clock that morning. He had 2 associates with him who sat with laptops open and said nothing. The backdated performance documentation is your biggest problem, Ashworth said. HR generated it based on supervisor notes that existed. Were those notes ever formally presented to the employee? Holt paused. I'd have to check. You don't have to check because the answer is clearly no, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. Ashworth's voice was not unkind, just direct. If those notes were generated or modified after the termination decision, we have a fabrication issue. If they pre-existed and were never disclosed to the employee per policy, we have a procedure issue. Either way, they cannot be part of your defense. They have to be walked back. If you walk them back, the termination rests entirely on the conduct basis, which is a cleaner argument but still difficult given the patient outcome. Ashworth folded his hands. The core problem, Bernard, is that a nurse you terminated for refusing to move a patient is the reason that patient is alive. That is the story as the public would understand it. Every legal argument we make exists inside that story, and that story is not favorable to Creekside. The return to the floor was unauthorized. It was. And that's the argument. But we need to decide if we're making it aggressively or if we're looking at resolution. He looked at Holt steadily. Is there anything connected to this situation that I should know about before we proceed? Anything outside the employment matter? Holt held the attorney's gaze. No. Ashworth held the gaze back for a moment. Then he nodded, the nod of a man who knew he'd just been lied to and was calculating what to do about it. All right, then the recommendation for today is this. No public statements, no contact with the nursing staff involved, no further documentation changes. We let the OIG inquiry, if there is one, develop on its own track and we don't intersect with it. Our lane is the employment matter only. And the Gould situation? What about it specifically? He had a prior complaint. A pause from Ashworth that was different from his other pauses. A reevaluation pause, the kind that happened when new information arrived that changed the geometry of a conversation. When was this complaint? 14 months ago. Was it active? It was closed. Who closed it? The room was quiet. Holt said the name of the VA staff member who had reviewed and dismissed the complaint and watched Ashworth's face do the thing that faces did when they were assembling pieces, and the picture they were forming was not the one they'd expected. Ashworth looked at his associates. Both of them were looking at him. He looked back at Holt. I think, he said carefully, that we need to have a different conversation, a considerably more detailed one. and I think you may need separate counsel for certain elements of what you're about to tell me. Sep. Raymond Gould was moved to the cardiac care unit at 9 in the morning, 12 hours after surgery had stabilized his pacemaker lead and addressed the internal bleeding from the fall. He was conscious, uncomfortable in the low-grade persistent way of post-surgical patients, and oriented, which was the clinical word for knowing where you were and what day it was. Though in Gould's case, it understated what was actually happening in his head. He was 64 years old and had spent 3 decades in institutional settings of various kinds, and he knew when something around him was moving. He could feel it in the way the nursing staff handled him. Careful, slightly over-attentive, the particular quality of attention that came from a unit that had been told this patient mattered in a way that wasn't entirely clinical. He could feel it in the fact that nobody had mentioned the nurse from the trauma bay, even though she was the reason he was having this conversation at all. His wife, Carol, had arrived from the house the previous night and was in the chair next to his bed with a crossword she wasn't doing and a coffee she wasn't drinking. And she had the look of someone who had been through enough medical emergencies with enough military personnel to know when to ask questions and when to just be present. "The nurse," Gould said. Carol looked up. "The one from last night. They fired her." "I know." She'd heard from the duty nurse who had been carefully neutral about it in the way that meant they knew more than they were saying. "How do you know?" "I heard the code team talking." He shifted against the pillow. "She went back in." Carol looked at him. "After they fired her," he said, "she heard my monitor and she went back in." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Ray?" Carol set the crossword down. "Your complaint last year." "I know. If this is connected." "I know, Carol." His voice was tired but not evasive. "I've been thinking about it since 3 in the morning. You need to tell someone." "I know that too." He looked at the ceiling of the cardiac unit, at the monitor above his bed running its green lines. "I need to find out who to tell." He found out 40 minutes later when a woman he'd never met walked into his room, showed him a federal ID, and introduced herself as Celia Marsh. What Marsh got from Raymond Gould in a 40-minute conversation she later described to Foster as the missing structural piece, not because it told her things she couldn't have found eventually, but because it told her things she couldn't have found quickly. And in investigations involving institutional corruption, speed mattered in inverse proportion to how long the corruption had been running. The longer it ran, the faster it covered itself once it felt exposure. Gould's complaint from 14 months ago had not simply been about billing irregularities. He had framed it that way because he'd understood from decades of working in and around institutional systems that billing irregularities were concrete and documentable and didn't sound like the raving of a man who was angry about his treatment. What he had actually observed during his previous admission, 2 years ago, a 3-day stay for a respiratory infection that had complicated into a pneumonia requiring IV antibiotics, was a pattern of equipment decisions that made no clinical sense. He'd been given a specific brand of monitoring equipment that his cardiologist, during a follow-up visit, had described as older generation and had expressed mild surprise about. He'd overheard a conversation between 2 nurses about a supply order that had been redirected. He'd seen a vendor badge on a man talking to a hospital administrator in the corridor outside his room, and he'd noted the name on the badge because he'd spent 3 years attached to military audit functions, and noting names was habit. The name on the badge was Meridian Health Solutions. He'd sat on that for 8 months before filing the complaint, because he wasn't certain, and because he'd also spent enough time in institutional settings to know that a complaint without specifics was worse than no complaint at all. When he finally filed it, he'd included 3 specific observations with dates and approximate times. The complaint had been closed in 6 weeks. The closure letter cited a review of procurement records and found no irregularities consistent with the described observations. What Gould had never been able to determine was who had actually reviewed it and whether they had actually looked at anything. Now he knew part of that answer, and when he gave Marsh the name on the vendor badge, the date, and the specific corridor outside his room, she wrote it down and then looked at Foster, who was standing near the door, and Foster nodded in a way that meant, "That matches something we already have." The name that Mara had written in her notebook, Meridian Health Solutions, was generating its own momentum at the OIG field office by mid-morning, independent of what was coming from Gould. Foster's Financial Crimes Unit had pulled the full procurement history for Creekside Valley going back 5 years, and had found a pattern that was cleaner than these patterns usually were, which was itself suspicious, because real procurement processes were messy, and the absence of mess in a 5-year record was the kind of thing that happened when someone had been careful rather than when someone had been compliant. The competitive bidding exemptions numbered 7. All 7 had been signed by Holt. All 7 involved vendors whose product specifications had been written in ways that, reviewed in isolation, looked like clinical requirement documents, and reviewed in sequence, looked like specifications designed backward from a vendor catalog. Meridian's contract alone accounted for 4 of the 7. The combined value of the 7 contracts over 5 years was slightly over $11 million. Foster put a call into the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Denver at 11:15, not to transfer jurisdiction, the OIG had its own investigative authority, but because one of the names in the financial thread had surfaced in a separate federal case that the FBI had opened 8 months ago and that had nothing to do with Creekside Valley, and the overlap was either coincidence or it was something that needed a broader lens. The FBI case involved a state-level official who had taken undisclosed payments from healthcare vendors operating in Colorado. The official worked for the Colorado State Medical Licensing Authority. His name was Leonard Voss. Mara didn't know about Voss yet. What she knew by 11 in the morning was that she'd been in a federal interview room for 3 hours, that she'd given Marsh everything she could give without entering territory she was not prepared to enter, and that she was running out of room to keep those two things separated. The moment came at 11:20 when Marsh asked a question that had been building in the subtext of the interview for the last hour. Ms. Delaney, your response time to Mr. Gould's deterioration event, catching the medication interaction, managing the pacing override, is inconsistent with the profile of a nurse with 4 years of outpatient and acute care experience. It's consistent with someone who has operated in environments where those skills were required under significantly more difficult conditions. Mara looked at her. I'm not asking you to disclose anything classified, Marsh said. I'm asking you to help me understand what we're working with. Because there are people at that hospital who are already trying to use your background against you, and I need to know what they have before they use it. What do you mean, use it against me? Marsh reached into the folder in front of her and pushed a single printed page across the table. It was a request form, a records access request, submitted yesterday afternoon, the afternoon of the termination, to the Department of Defense's Personnel Records Office. The request cited a legal hold justification and asked for complete service records for a nurse practitioner named Mara Delaney, citing her nursing license number as the identifier. The request had been filed by a law firm. The law firm was Ashworth and Dale. Mara looked at the page. Her face was doing something she couldn't entirely control, which was unusual for her, and she recognized the thing happening in her chest as something adjacent to anger, but older and less clean than anger. They filed this yesterday, she said, within 6 hours of your termination, which tells me they anticipated this conversation before we made contact. They're looking for my service record. Yes. And depending on what they find, or what they think they might find, they'll use it to characterize you as unstable, as someone with trauma history that makes your clinical judgment unreliable, as... Marsh stopped. Not because she'd run out of words, but because she could see from Mara's face that she didn't need to continue. I need to know what's in that record. Mara looked at the table, at the printed page, at her own hands, which had gone still in the way they went still when she was making a decision that had already been made before she consciously acknowledged it. She thought about a mountain range she'd never named to anyone here, about 3 men whose names she still knew and who did not appear in any database because the operation in which they'd been injured did not officially exist, about a commendation she'd received in a ceremony that was not photographed, and in a room that had no official address, from a commanding officer who had retired under a cover identity that she'd never been told, only shown. About the medic's bag she'd carried through 17 months of extractions and ambushes and situations in which the only medical protocol that applied was whatever she could improvise with what she had on her back. She looked up at Celia Marsh. There's a classification level on what I did, she said. I'm not sure what the current status is. Some of it may have rolled down by now, some of it won't have. I have a clearance that it's not about your clearance. It's about whether the people who classified it have signed off on disclosure. And I don't know the answer to that without making a contact that I haven't made in 4 years. Marsh leaned forward slightly. Can you make that contact? Possibly, but I need to know something first. Mara looked at her directly. If I open that door, if I make that contact and whatever was classified becomes relevant to this investigation, are you in a position to protect it? Not me. It, the operational content. Marsh understood what she was asking. It wasn't about Mara's personal exposure. It was about other people, about things that had happened in places that were still active, still sensitive, still attached to ongoing operations. I'll need to bring in someone from the Defense Coordination Office, Marsh said. That's not a delay, Asat. It's standard protocol when federal investigations intersect classified military records. It would take me about 4 hours to get the right person on the phone. Then I need 4 hours too, Mara said, and I need to make my call privately. She made the call from a bench in a park 2 blocks from the federal office because she wanted open space around her when she did it. The number wasn't saved anywhere. She had memorized it during a briefing that had ended with the words, "If you ever need this, you'll know why," and she hadn't dialed it in 4 years, and she didn't know if it still worked. It rang 3 times, and then a recorded message told her the number was not in service. She sat with the deadline for a moment. Then she dialed a second number, a different kind of contact, a person rather than a line, someone she'd worked alongside briefly at the end of her service, and who had transitioned into a liaison role between military medical operations and federal law enforcement. His name was Marcus Webb. The phone rang twice. Delaney? His voice was immediately alert in the way voices got when they'd been trained to receive unexpected calls as information. It's been a while. 4 years? I know. I've been watching your LinkedIn. Harlan Falls, nursing. Not anymore, apparently. A pause. What happened? She told him the condensed version, 90 seconds. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "And now OIG is involved." Yes? And they want the file. They want to understand what's in it before Ashworth and Dale uses it against me. Ashworth and Dale. He repeated the name with a flatness that meant he was processing it. They filed a records request? Yesterday afternoon. He was quiet for several seconds. She could hear him breathing, which meant he wasn't hiding the fact that he was thinking. I can make a call, he said, to someone who can determine what's currently classified and what isn't. It's going to flag the request. You understand that? I do. And if what they find is still active, then it's still active and they can't use it, Mara said. But at least the OIG will know what Ashworth and Dale is trying to find, which matters. Give me 2 hours. He hung up. She sat on the bench and watched pigeons move across the path in front of her with the dedicated, unglamorous efficiency of creatures that had one job and did it without complaint. After a while, she took out her notebook and wrote down the time and what she'd said and what Webb had said, because she wrote everything down. Because it was the discipline that had saved her more than once in settings where the only record that mattered was the one you kept yourself. She was on the 3rd line when her phone rang. Not Webb, not Marsh. It was Donna Reyes. You need to hear this right now, Donna said, her voice low and stripped of its usual compression. And you need to be somewhere private. I'm outside, I'm alone. Preston Mays came to me an hour ago. He got a call from hospital HR last night. A breath. They told him that if he submitted a revised incident report, specifically removing the timing details about Gould's deterioration and your re-entry to the bay, his probationary review would be handled favorably. The park was very quiet around her. They asked a 3rd-year nurse to falsify a federal incident report, Mara said. Yes. Did he? No. He came to me instead. He's scared, but he didn't do it. Donna's voice had a quality in it that Mara had never heard before in 4 years. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a person who had been operating on professional principle and had just discovered the principle was going to cost them something real. Mara, if they're asking Preston to do that, it means they need the timing gone. And if they need the timing gone, it means they already know someone is looking at the sequence. Someone is, Mara said. How far along? Far enough that they're scared. A silence. Then, what do I do? Take Preston to Patricia Odom, today. She needs his statement before HR has time to characterize his conversation with them as routine. And Donna, Mara stopped because what she wanted to say was something about being careful, and it felt both inadequate and condescending, and she settled instead on what was actually true. You've already done the most important thing. You documented it when no one was watching. That's what's going to matter. She ended the call, sat for a moment longer, then walked back to the federal office because there was no more time for park benches or pigeons or the particular luxury of thinking before you moved. The machinery had started, and it was not going to wait. It was Marcus Webb who called her at 2:14, not to say what she'd expected him to say. I made the contact, he said, and I have to tell you something. Go ahead. The records request from Ashworth and Dale flagged something, not in the classification office. It flagged in a different system, one that monitors legal discovery attempts on records associated with certain operations. He paused. Delaney, someone has already been in your records. Not Ashworth and Dale. Someone else, 3 weeks ago. Someone with a clearance high enough to access the raw operational file, not just the service summary. She stopped walking. What? Whoever it was ran a search on your identifier and accessed 2 specific documents from the operational record. Then closed the session. No output, no copy request. Just read. Who? The access log shows a contractor ID, not a personal credential. We're running the contractor chain now, but Delaney, his voice had the tone it had when he was about to say something he wished he didn't have to say. The timing, 3 weeks ago. If someone was already looking at your file 3 weeks ago, it wasn't because of what happened yesterday morning. It wasn't because of what happened yesterday morning. She stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building in the pale afternoon light of Harlan Falls and let that sentence settle into her. Someone had been watching her before Raymond Gould, before the termination, before all of it, which meant either she had already been identified as a threat or someone had found her file for a reason she didn't yet understand. And what happened in Trauma Bay 2 had not started a sequence of events, but had instead accelerated one that was already in motion. The door of the federal office opened, and Celia Marsh appeared at the top of the steps. And even from 20 feet away, Mara could see from her face that something had changed in the time she'd been outside. You need to come back in, Marsh said. What happened? Marsh looked at her with the expression of a person who had spent their career processing difficult information and who was still, despite all of that, having a moment with what she was about to say. Leonard Voss is in FBI custody as of 40 minutes ago, she said. And when they picked him up, he was in a car outside your apartment building. The words landed the way certain words did. Not loud, but with a weight that compressed everything around them. Mara climbed the steps without responding because there was nothing to say yet, not until she was inside and sitting down and had time to think through what it meant that Leonard Voss had been in a car outside her apartment. She had not been home since yesterday morning. She had gone from the hospital parking structure to the diner to Patricia Odom's office to her car, to a motel on the east side where she'd paid cash and slept badly for 5 hours. The apartment she'd been paying rent on for 4 years had been empty when Voss was outside it. That was either luck or not luck, and she didn't know which yet. Marsh took her back into the conference room. Foster was gone. In his place was a man she hadn't seen before, late 40s, dark jacket, the specific quality of stillness that law enforcement developed over years of sitting in rooms where things were about to happen. He introduced himself as Special Agent Darren Colt, FBI Denver Field Office, Financial Crimes and Public Corruption. I'll get to Voss, he said before she could ask. But first, I want to make sure you understand your current situation. I'm listening. As of an hour ago, this investigation is no longer a preliminary OIG inquiry. It's a joint federal investigation, OIG and FBI, with DOJ oversight requested. That happened because of what we found when we ran the contractor ID that accessed your military records 3 weeks ago. He looked at her steadily. The contractor account was a shell. The access originated from a terminal inside the Colorado State Medical Licensing Authority. And the only person in that office with clearance sufficient to run that kind of search had credentials that were obtained through a process we are still unpacking, but which involved misrepresentation to the issuing agency. Voss? Mara said. Voss.
Colt nodded. Who is not just a corrupt licensing official. Leonard Voss spent 11 years in federal contracting before he went into state regulatory work. And in those 11 years, he built a network of relationships between defense-adjacent contractors and healthcare vendors that we are now understanding was significantly larger than any single thread suggested. Meridian Health is one node in that network. Creekside Valley is one client. There are others.
Mara looked at the table. How many others? We're still mapping it, but at least 4 other hospital systems in the state have procurement contracts that follow the same pattern as Creekside's. Same vendor relationships, same exemption structures, same political coverage. Colt leaned forward slightly. What we didn't have until today was a direct line connecting Voss to the surveillance of a specific individual. Your file, which tells us he knew something about you specifically, not just about Creekside, that he considered a threat to the network. He found my service record 3 weeks ago, Mara said, before anything happened at the hospital. Yes. Which means someone told him to look. Colt held her gaze. That's what we're working on. She sat with that. 3 weeks ago, she had been a nurse at Creekside Valley with a clean record and a quiet life and no reason, as far as she knew, to be on anyone's list. 3 weeks ago, she had treated patients and filled out documentation and bought groceries and done laundry and not once felt the specific sensation of being watched that she'd learned to recognize in other settings, in other years. She thought about Raymond Gould, about the complaint he'd filed 14 months ago, about the VA staffer who'd closed it and then taken a consulting contract from a Meridian subsidiary. Was Gould flagged when he was admitted? She asked. Colt and Marsh exchanged a look. We believe so, Marsh said. We believe his name triggered an alert in an administrative monitoring system at Creekside, something that Holt had access to and that notified him when certain patients checked in. Patients who had filed complaints, patients who had flagged vendor relationships, patients who were, in the broadest sense, problematic. And when Gould came in yesterday, Holt was there within 20 minutes of admission, Marsh said, which is not his normal pattern. He typically comes in at 8:30, 9. Yesterday, he was on the floor at 6:45. The timing that Donna had documented, the timing that Holt had wanted Preston Mays to remove from the incident report. He wasn't there for Curtis Fenn, Mara said. It wasn't a question. Fenn's arrival was probably convenient. The room clearing request gave him a procedural lever, but we think the reason he was on that floor at that hour was Raymond Gould. Marsh's voice was even. We think he came to assess the situation. Whether any action was planned or whether the room clearing was an improvised response to finding Gould in a vulnerable condition, we don't know yet. But the sequence is documented. Mara looked at the wall for a moment. And Voss outside my building. He was in a parked car on the street facing the main entrance, Colt said. No active surveillance equipment. He had a phone and a notepad. When the FBI unit approached, they'd been tracking his vehicle since his name surfaced in our system this morning. He did not resist. He was cooperative in a way that suggested he already knew the arrest was coming and had made decisions about how to handle it. What kind of decisions? The kind that involve a phone call to an attorney before the agents reached his window. That was deliberate. The kind of deliberate that meant Voss had seen the shape of the day and had positioned himself to trade rather than fight. Men like Voss, men who operated in networks, who were connectors rather than architects, they calculated their value in information, and they used that calculation the moment the walls started moving. He's going to cooperate, Mara said, almost certainly. His attorney has already signaled a willingness to talk. Then he'll give you Holt. He'll give us Holt and everyone else, Colt said. That's what we're counting on. He paused. But there's a reason I'm telling you this now, Ms. Delaney, before we've completed the Voss interview. The reason is that when Voss talks, your name will come up, not as a target, but as a piece of the story. Why your records were accessed, why Holt moved the way he moved yesterday, why any of this is the shape it is. He looked at her with the directness of a man who respected the person he was talking to enough to not soften things unnecessarily. I need your military record on the table before Voss puts his version of it on the table, because his version will be constructed to serve his interests, and I need something accurate to measure it against. She had known this moment was coming since she'd walked into the building. She had known it since Marsh pushed the records request form across the conference table. Maybe, in some way, she had known it was coming since she walked back through the doors of Trauma Bay 2 and picked up exactly where she'd left off, as if she'd never been away, as if there was a version of herself that had never left at all. She pulled out her phone, dialed Marcus Webb. He answered on the first ring. "I'm with the FBI," she said. "I need the file on the table. Whatever they can declassify today, I need today." A pause. "I made a call to the right office 20 minutes ago when Colt's name came up in my system. They're expecting this." Another pause. "Delaney, some of it is still active." "I know. The operations component, I know what's in it, Marcus." A breath. "They'll send what they can. It'll take about 3 hours. The rest will come with a classification notice that Colt's office will know how to handle." He paused one more time, and in that pause was something she recognized as the closest Marcus Webb got to something personal. "For what it's worth, whoever tried to use it against you miscalculated. What's in that file doesn't make you look unstable. It makes you look like exactly what you are." She ended the call, looked at Colt. 3 hours. "We'll be here," he said. Hassan. Bernard Holt learned about Voss's arrest the same way he learned about most things that happened outside his direct control, through a chain of people who each told him slightly less than they knew. The first call came from a hospital board member who had heard it from a political contact. The second came from Ashworth, who had heard it from a source in the federal courthouse, and who had upgraded in the 24 hours since their previous conversation from moderately concerned attorney to attorney who was using words like exposure and separation in the careful way that meant he was already thinking about which client to protect when both of them became untenable. "Voss is in federal custody," Ashworth said. "That changes your situation materially." Holt was in his office. It was 3 in the afternoon, and the 4th floor of Creekside Valley looked exactly the way it always looked at this hour. Administrative staff at desks, the quiet hum of institutional operations, nobody in the corridor who knew that the ground underneath it was moving. How materially? If Voss cooperates, and given the pattern of his prior conduct in other matters, he will cooperate. He will give them the complete financial structure. Every contract, every relationship, every payment that moved through the network. Ashworth's voice was clipped and without the deliberate pace of their previous conversation, which told Holt that Ashworth was no longer billing by the word and was instead managing a situation he was genuinely concerned about. At that point, Bernard, the question is not whether you are exposed. The question is the degree and the timing. What does timing mean? It means that people who come forward proactively before they are named by a cooperating witness are treated differently than people who are named and then come forward. Significantly differently. And the window for that distinction closes the moment Voss finishes his first interview. Holt looked out his window at the hospital campus, at the parking lot where he'd parked the same car in the same spot for 9 years, at the building he'd spent 9 years making work the way it worked. "I need more time," he said. "You don't have more time," Ashworth said, not unkindly, just accurately. The federal document transmission arrived at Colt's office at 5:47, 3 hours and 11 minutes after Mara made the call to Webb. It came in 2 parts. The first was a declassified service summary, dates, unit affiliations described in general terms, a list of operational theaters with the specific location details removed, and a record of commendations that had been updated to remove the citation language while retaining the classifications of the commendations themselves. The second was a sealed addendum accompanied by a Defense Department classification notice that specified the contents were accessible to Colt and Marsh under their existing federal clearances but were not to be copied, transmitted, or referenced in any public document without separate authorization. Colt read both. Marsh read both. They didn't speak for several minutes after they finished, which told Mara more than anything they could have said. "How much of this did you know we didn't know?" Colt said finally. "All of it," Mara said. "That was the design. The extraction you supported in—" He stopped because the location was in the sealed section, and he was being careful. "The medical response. 3 casualties, 2 survivors." "Yes. Your assessment under fire, the decisions you made in the field. There's a review board finding in here from a military medical ethics panel. They concluded that every decision you made was within or above the standard of care given the conditions. I know. Which means that whatever Ashworth and Dale was hoping to find in your record, they were hoping to find something that looked like I'd been involved in a bad outcome, Mara said. Something they could strip of context and present as a pattern of reckless clinical judgment. Marsh looked at her. And instead they found the opposite.
The opposite is still classified, Mara said, which is why they couldn't have actually used it. They just needed the suggestion of it. An unopened box that implies something bad inside is worth more in a legal proceeding than a box someone's opened and found empty. She looked at them both. They were going to request access to sealed military records in a civil wrongful termination proceeding, have the access denied on classification grounds, and then argue to the court that the denial itself demonstrated there was something in the record worth hiding. It's a procedural tactic. It works if no one calls the bluff. Colt was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this a great deal. I had a long night. What none of them said, because it didn't need to be said, was that the tactic had failed the moment the OIG opened a joint federal investigation, because in that context, the classification wasn't an obstacle. It was accessible, and accessible meant examinable, and examinable meant the bluff was called before it was ever played. At 6:15, Leonard Voss's attorney called the FBI's Denver field office and confirmed that his client was prepared to provide a full proffer, a complete account of his knowledge and involvement in exchange for consideration in the charging process. Colt took the call in the hallway outside the conference room and came back with the expression of someone who had just confirmed something they'd expected and were still processing the scope of. He sat down. Voss's attorney says his client has documentation. Physical documentation that he maintained independently of the network. His own records, kept separately, apparently as insurance against exactly this situation. What kind of documentation? Marsh asked. Financial records, communications, contract correspondence. His attorney describes it as comprehensive. Colt looked at Mara. He also says Voss has information about the nature of the surveillance conducted on you, specifically who initiated the request to access your military records and why. Mara went very still. It wasn't Holt. No, Colt said. According to the attorney's preliminary statement, the request originated above Holt, significantly above. The conference room was quiet. Congressman Daley, Marsh said. Not a question. The attorney didn't name him, but the description of the originating party, the political relationship, the geographic jurisdiction, the connection to the Meridian funding chain, points in that direction. Colt looked at both of them. We're not there yet. That requires the full proffer and independent corroboration. But if Voss has documentation showing that a sitting congressman directed surveillance of a private citizen's classified military records as part of an effort to protect a corrupt procurement network, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mara thought about Congressman Warren Daley. She didn't know him. She'd seen his name in local news the way you saw the names of local congressmen, in the background of things, reliably present without being particularly distinct. A man who had been in office 6 years, who had infrastructure funding relationships that Creekside had benefited from, who had an aide with a kidney stone who needed a private room on a Tuesday morning, a man who, if Voss's documentation said what the attorney was suggesting it said, had used his political access to direct a search of a private citizen's classified service record, because that citizen worked in a hospital that was central to a procurement network worth millions of dollars, and because whatever was in that record was considered either a threat or a potential weapon. She thought about the night Celia Marsh had told her the investigation might be bigger than she thought. She thought about sitting in a diner eating eggs she didn't eat, writing in a notebook, and writing Meridian Health at the top of a clean page because a retired federal operative had named it in a phone call she'd almost let go to voicemail. She thought about Raymond Gould's hand finding hers. The chain from that moment to this one was, she supposed, not accidental. The chain from that moment to this one was the thing that happened when one correct decision made under pressure, with incomplete information, and at significant personal cost, turned out to have been the fulcrum. Something much larger was resting on. By 9 o'clock that evening, the Voss proffer was underway in a federal conference room in Denver. Mara was not in the room.
She was in a government-arranged hotel 2 blocks from the federal building in Harlan Falls, having been advised by both Colt and Marsh that remaining at her apartment was inadvisable until the investigation's more volatile phase had passed. The hotel room was unremarkable. She sat at the desk with her notebook and wrote until she ran out of new things to write, and then she sat without writing and thought about what came next. Her nursing license was intact. That much Colt had confirmed before she left. Whatever documentation Creekside's HR had filed with the state licensing board, and they had filed something, it had been flagged by the licensing authority's investigative office as connected to a matter under federal review, which meant it was on hold. Held documentation couldn't trigger a suspension. She was still technically licensed to practice. She was also unemployed, the target of a falsified personnel record, and the central witness in a federal investigation that was expanding by the hour. She was in a hotel room with a notebook and a phone and a glass of water, which was not so different from how she'd spent a number of other nights in other places, except that in those other places, she'd had a unit around her. She thought about that sometimes. The specific texture of not being alone in the way she had not been alone during those years. It wasn't about the people exactly, because some of the people had been difficult and some of them she'd actively disliked. It was about the shared orientation, the understanding among everyone present that the work was the work and it was the only thing that mattered, and you either did it or you didn't, and no one asked you to feel a particular way about it. She didn't allow herself to stay in that thought too long, because it was the kind of thought that could take up a lot of room if you gave it space. Her phone rang. Webb. "The contractor chain," he said. "We traced it." She sat up straighter. "And? The clearance used to access your records 3 weeks ago was obtained through a DoD contractor account. The account is registered to a defense logistics consulting firm in Virginia. That firm's principal contracts in the last 4 years have been with, and I want to be precise here, a set of federal healthcare infrastructure programs administered through a specific congressional appropriations subcommittee." "Daley's subcommittee," Mara said. "He chairs the relevant subcommittee, has for 3 years. Webb's voice was careful in the way it got when the information was significant enough to require carefulness. The contractor account was accessed from an IP address in the Washington, D.C. metro area. The access occurred on a Thursday afternoon. Congress was in session that week. Marcus, are you telling me this came from Capitol Hill? I'm telling you the technical origin of the access is consistent with that. I'm not telling you that a congressman personally accessed your military file." He paused. "But someone in his orbit did. Someone with connections to defense contracting and healthcare appropriations, and a specific reason to know who you were and what was in your record." 3 weeks ago, Mara said, before Gould was admitted. "Yes, which means—" She stopped because the implication was significant enough to require saying carefully. Someone in Daley's network was already aware that Creekside had a vulnerability, a specific person on their staff who might be a problem. 3 weeks ago, before anything happened. That's what the access pattern suggests. She looked at the wall of the hotel room, beige, a painting of something scenic, the ordinary background of a room designed to be forgotten. "They were building a case against me," she said, "before I'd done anything. Or they were building a contingency, in case you did. Either way, it meant that whatever had happened in Trauma Bay 2 on a Tuesday morning was not the beginning of anything. It was the activation of something already prepared. They had known she was there. They had known, or suspected, that she was the kind of person who would, in the right circumstances, become a problem. And they had gone looking for the tool to manage that problem before the problem materialized. She thought about the scale of that, the specific kind of institutional paranoia, no, not paranoia, preparation, required to surveil a nurse in a mid-sized Colorado hospital because she had a service background that someone found threatening. It should have made her feel small, exposed. The way she expected it would feel to discover that people in positions of significant power had been looking at her name in a file before she'd given them any reason. Instead, she felt something else, something colder and more useful. The Voss proffer lasted 7 hours. Mara was asleep for 4 of them, which was not restful sleep, but was sleep. She woke at 6 in the morning to 3 messages. The first was from Colt, brief, telling her he needed to speak with her at 9. The second was from Patricia Odom, who had been in contact with the hospital board's outside legal counsel, and who had 4 words that communicated everything. They want to talk. The third message was from a number she didn't recognize, sent at 2:17 in the morning from an area code she identified as the Denver Metro. It contained 4 sentences. My name is Carol Gould. My husband asked me to find your number. He's been awake most of the night. He wants you to know that he filed his complaint 14 months ago because he believed someone had to say something. He wanted you to know that.
She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a moment, not doing anything, just sitting. Then she got up, washed her face, made the bad hotel coffee, and opened her notebook to a new page.
The 9 o'clock meeting with Colt and Marsh was not in the conference room. It was in Colt's actual office, which was slightly smaller and considerably more real feeling. A desk with actual work on it, a window that looked at another building's exterior, 2 chairs that didn't match. Voss gave us everything, Colt said without preamble. Everything was a large word, and he was using it accurately. 7 hours of proffer had produced a complete financial map of the Meridian network, contracts, payments, the consulting structure through BH Advisory Services that connected Holt to vendor kickbacks, the process by which competitive bids had been systematically excluded through specification rigging, the political funding relationships that provided cover, and the internal communication chain that showed the network had been operating in various configurations for 6 years. The documentation Voss had maintained independently, his insurance, included emails, payment records, and 3 recorded phone calls. One of the phone calls was between Voss and a senior staffer in Congressman Daley's office, in which the staffer directed Voss to check the background of a specific Creekside employee whose name had come up in connection with the Gould complaint review. That employee was Mara. The call was from 3 weeks and 2 days ago. It had been recorded by Voss without the staffer's knowledge, which was a legal issue in a small number of states and not a legal issue in the relevant jurisdiction, and which Voss's attorney had specifically confirmed before providing it. The staffer's name is Kevin Fallow, Colt said. He's been with Daley's office for 4 years. His background includes a prior position with a defense contractor that had connections to the same Virginia consulting firm that held the clearance used to access your records. He looked at her steadily. We are not able to establish from current evidence that Daley personally directed any of this. What we can establish is that his office was involved, that a senior staffer acting in his official capacity directed surveillance of a private citizen, and that this surveillance was connected to the protection of a procurement fraud network. Will you get to Daley? Fallow will talk, Marsh said. People like Fallow always calculate that the person above them is more protected than they are, and they're usually right, and eventually they decide that the protection isn't worth what they're being asked to hold. She paused. It takes time, but the foundation is there. Mara accepted that. Time was a variable she had some experience managing. Bernard Holt, she said. Colt picked up a folder. Holt contacted our office at 7:53 this morning through his attorney. He's requesting a meeting. He opened the folder. His attorney's language is, Mr. Holt wishes to discuss his willingness to provide a complete account of his knowledge of the Meridian Health procurement arrangements and related matters, in exchange for consideration of his cooperation in determining charges and sentencing. Mara looked at the folder, at the careful lawyered language in which a man who had fired her in a hospital corridor while her patient was dying was now asking for the consideration that she had not been offered. He broke, she said. He broke, Colt confirmed. Voss's cooperation removed the last structure Holt was relying on. Without Voss, he has no corroboration, no shared interest, and no one to take the larger exposure. He's the most visible actor in the most documented portion of the scheme. The procurement records are at Creekside, which is under federal oversight. His signatures are on 7 contracts. His consulting LLC is traceable. Colt set the folder down. He was always going to be the one who broke first. Voss understood that too, which is why he moved before Holt did. And the hospital? This time it was Marsh who answered. The board convened an emergency session last night. Pamela Griggs has been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. An interim administrator has been appointed, someone external, brought in by the board's outside legal team. We have a meeting with the board's counsel this afternoon. She paused. And Ms. Delaney, the board's first priority, according to their counsel, is resolving your employment situation. Mara looked at the mismatched chairs, the real work desk, the window looking at another building's exterior. They want to settle, she said. They want more than that, Marsh said. They want to demonstrate to the federal oversight body that they are actively cooperating and actively remediating. A settlement doesn't do that. A settlement looks like you buying silence. Remediating looks like acknowledging what actually happened, Mara said. Yes. She thought about Raymond Gould awake at 2 a.m, his wife finding a phone number, 4 sentences sent from a Denver area code. She thought about Donna Reyes filing 3 incident reports before anyone told her to, and Preston Mays walking into Donna's office instead of signing a form that would have made his probationary review easier. The board's counsel, she said. What's the meeting at? 2 o'clock. If you want to be there. I want to be there. She said it the way she'd said most of the things she'd said in the past 48 hours. Directly, without the hedging that was sometimes useful and here was not. And Marsh wrote something on her notepad and nodded and said they'd arranged transportation. At 11 o'clock, before the afternoon meeting, Mara went back to her apartment for the first time since Tuesday morning. She had been advised it was safe. The street outside was ordinary, a car that belonged there, a neighbor walking with a stroller, the building looking exactly the way it always looked. She stood outside it for a moment before going in, because she'd learned to notice the space between leaving a place and coming back to it, the way a place held or didn't hold the shape of what had happened in your absence. She went upstairs, changed clothes, stood in her kitchen and drank a glass of water that was better than the hotel water because it was from her own tap and she knew how it tasted. On her kitchen table was the notebook she'd left here 2 days ago. Not the one she'd taken with her, another one, older. She'd been keeping notes in it for months, the way she kept notes on most things, not because she'd expected any of it to matter, but because the habit was too ingrained to stop. She opened it to a page from 8 weeks ago. There was a date at the top. Below the date was a single entry. Meridian equipment in Bay 3 again. 3rd time this month. Older model. Why? She looked at that for a long moment. 8 weeks ago. 2 months before Raymond Gould was admitted. 2 months before any of this had a name. She had noticed. She had written it down and then turned the page and gone about her work. Because noticing was the habit, and acting on what you noticed required a threshold that a single entry in a notebook didn't reach. But it was there. Dated. In her handwriting. In a notebook she hadn't taken with her. She took a photograph of the page with her phone. Then she took the notebook itself, because it was evidence and she now understood that anything that was evidence needed to be in the right hands. She was at the door, notebook in hand, when her phone rang. It was Patricia Odom. I just received something from the hospital board's counsel, Patricia said. Her voice had a specific quality that meant she was containing a reaction. They've sent a preliminary offer document ahead of the 2 o'clock meeting. And Mara, there's something in it that isn't standard. What is it? They're not just offering reinstatement. Patricia paused. They're offering reinstatement with a structural change to the hospital's administrative authority over clinical staff. A written policy limiting administrative interference in active patient care. They're calling it a Patient Care Protection Amendment. Mara stood in her doorway. They want to make it policy. They want it in writing, approved by the board, submitted to the state health authority. They want it to be the documented outcome of this situation. Another pause. And they've specifically, in the document, in writing, cited your actions on Tuesday as the clinical standard the policy is designed to protect. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. The hallway outside was quiet. Somewhere in the building, someone was playing music, faint through the walls. She thought about what it meant. Not the reinstatement. That was expected, inevitable, a consequence of the documented record. The policy was different. The policy was the acknowledgement that what she had done was not just correct, but was the kind of correct that needed to be made permanent, because it would happen again to someone else in some other corridor in some other hospital, and the next person might not have her particular background, and the next patient might not survive. Patricia, she said, before we go into this meeting, I need you to read something else. She photographed the notebook page again and sent it. Then she described what it was, what it meant, when she'd written it. The line was quiet for several seconds. Mara, Patricia's voice was very careful. This is documentation of prior knowledge of a procurement irregularity. This isn't just your employment case anymore. I know. This goes directly to the federal investigation. Colt needs to see this before 2 o'clock. I'm on my way to him now, Mara said, and walked out of her apartment into the building's corridor, the notebook in her hand, the door clicking shut behind her. She was at the stairwell when her phone buzzed again. Not a call. A news alert from a local Harlan Falls outlet that she had installed 4 years ago and checked maybe 3 times total. The headline read, Creekside Valley Medical Center. COO Bernard Holt resigns amid federal inquiry. She read it once, kept walking. At the bottom of the alert, in the last line of the brief story, was a sentence that made her stop on the landing between floors. Sources close to the investigation indicate federal charges are expected to be filed within 72 hours, and that a second individual connected to state regulatory operations has already been taken into custody. Separately, a congressional office has confirmed that a senior staffer has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review, but declined to specify the nature of the matter under review. She read it 3 more times. Then she walked down the last flight of stairs, pushed through the building's lobby door, and stepped out into the morning. The morning air outside her building had the particular quality that Colorado mornings had in the hour after sunrise, thin and cold and honest, without the layer of warmth that would come later and make everything feel more manageable. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the notebook in her hand and the news alert still on her phone screen and let the cold sit on her face. Holt had resigned. A congressional staffer was on administrative leave. Voss was in custody. The walls were coming down in the sequence that walls came down when the foundation was pulled. Not all at once, but in a cascade, each piece taking the next with it. She walked to her car. Colt read the notebook entry twice, then had one of his associates photograph it under controlled conditions and log it as evidence while she watched. He asked her 3 questions: when she'd written it, whether she'd mentioned it to anyone at the time, and whether there were other entries like it. There were 2 others, smaller, less specific, but dated. Equipment observations, supply rotation anomalies, the kind of thing a nurse noticed and filed away because it didn't cross a threshold, and the threshold was high because hospitals were imperfect systems, and imperfect systems generated noise. You were noticing the network's footprint, Colt said, without the frame to identify what you were looking at. Yes. These entries predate your termination by 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and 14 weeks. They're consistent with what we've established about the meridian supply rotation at the facility. He closed the notebook carefully. This goes into the federal evidentiary record. I'll need a signed statement from you describing the context and timing of each entry. I understand. It also means, he said, that the argument Ashworth and Dale were building, that your actions on Tuesday were erratic, that your return to the trauma bay was unauthorized recklessness, becomes considerably harder to sustain. Because what this shows is a pattern of clinical attentiveness going back months. It shows a nurse who was consistently paying attention in exactly the way a nurse should be. She looked at the notebook in his hands, at the worn cover, the slightly bent corner from where she'd dropped it once and not straightened it. I wasn't investigating them, she said. I just noticed things. I know, Colt said. That's what makes it credible. The 2 o'clock meeting with the hospital board's council occupied a conference room on the 3rd floor of a law office 2 blocks from Creekside Valley. Neutral ground, which was the board's idea and which was appropriate, because walking back into that building before anything was formally resolved would have required a kind of composure Mara wasn't sure she had yet. Patricia Odom sat beside her. Across the table was the board's external legal counsel, a woman named Sandra Vreeland who had clearly been doing institutional damage control for long enough to be precise about it, and 2 board members, both of whom had joined the board within the last 18 months and who had, according to Patricia's research, no direct connection to Griggs or Holt's procurement arrangements. The preliminary offer document had been updated since Patricia received it that morning. Someone had been busy. Vreeland laid out the terms methodically. The wrongful termination finding was formal and unconditional. The board had voted on it that morning. The fabricated performance documentation had been removed from Mara's personnel file and formally documented as unauthorized, with a notation that the individual responsible had been identified and referred to the board's ethics committee. Full back pay for the period of termination. Reinstatement at her prior position with seniority intact. Then the policy amendment. Vreeland walked through it clause by clause, and it was more specific than the preliminary version Patricia had described on the phone. The amendment prohibited any administrative directive that required the movement, transfer, or discharge of a patient currently receiving active emergency intervention without the written authorization of the attending physician. It created a formal reporting mechanism for nurses to document administrative interference without fear of retaliation, routed directly to the board rather than through hospital management. It established mandatory annual training for all administrative staff on clinical authority boundaries. It was, in the language of institutional policy, exactly what should have already existed. There's one additional element, Vreeland said, that the board added this morning after reviewing the evidentiary timeline. She slid a single page across the table. A formal public acknowledgement to be released through the hospital's communications office, describing the events of Tuesday morning and specifically citing Nurse Delaney's actions as the reason Raymond Gould survived. Patricia looked at the page, then at Mara. Mara read it. It was short, 3 paragraphs. It named her. It described what she had done. It described what had been done to her. It did not use euphemisms. The board understands, Vreeland said, that this is not a private settlement. This cannot be a private settlement. The federal investigation is public, and the outcome will be public, and the board's position is that they would rather define their response than have it defined for them. She paused. But I want to be direct with you, Ms. Delaney. The board also believes this is the right thing to do. There are 8 board members. I have spoken with all 8 in the past 18 hours.
The vote on the formal acknowledgement was unanimous. The
room was quiet. Patricia put her hand briefly on the table near Mara's arm. Not quite contact, just proximity. The kind of thing you did when you understood that a person was processing something significant and didn't need words for it. Mara looked at the page, at her own name in an official document that was not a termination letter and not a fabricated performance note. Her name in a document that said, she was right, and this is what right cost her, and this is what we owe her. It was not a perfect document. It was careful in the way institutional documents were careful, and it protected the board in the way board communications always protected the board, and it would be read by the hospital's PR team before it went anywhere public. It was not the same as Raymond Gould telling her she'd saved his life. It was not the same as Donna Reyes filing 3 incident reports before sunrise, but it was real, permanent, the kind of thing that lived in a record and could not be made to disappear. I have some conditions, Mara said. Vreeland nodded. She'd expected this. The policy amendment goes to the state health authority within 30 days, not filed for review, submitted with the board's active endorsement, and a formal recommendation for adoption as a statewide standard. Vreeland made a note. That's achievable. Preston Mays, the third-year nurse who was asked to falsify an incident report. His personnel record is cleared of any notation connected to Tuesday's events, and his probationary review is conducted by an external evaluator, not internal management. Agreed. Donna Reyes receives a formal commendation from the board for her documentation of the incident, in writing, for her file. A brief pause from Vreeland. Also agreed. Mara looked at the table for a moment. And Raymond Gould's prior complaint, the one that was closed 14 months ago through a compromised review process, I want the board to formally request that the VA reopen and properly adjudicate it. With a letter from the board acknowledging that the original closure was influenced by the same network now under federal investigation. That one took longer. Vreeland looked at the 2 board members. Something passed between them that was a decision being made in real time. That's outside our direct authority, Vreeland said carefully. But the board can make that request formally. Yes. Patricia was writing. She didn't look up. We'll need all of this in the amended offer document before anyone signs anything. Understood, Vreeland said. We can have a revised document by end of business tomorrow. This afternoon, Patricia said, still not looking up. Given the timeline of the federal investigation, tomorrow is not adequate. Vreeland looked at Patricia with an expression that recognized a person who knew exactly how much leverage she was working with. This afternoon, then. The federal charges came on a Thursday, 71 hours after Voss's arrest, precisely within the window Colt had described. Bernard Holt was charged with procurement fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and retaliation against a healthcare worker. the last charge carrying its own specific federal weight under statutes protecting medical professionals from institutional coercion. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that everyone in the relevant offices understood was a procedural position, not an actual defense. Leonard Voss was charged with bribery of a public official, conspiracy, unauthorized access to classified federal records, and stalking. The stalking charge stemming from his presence outside Mara's apartment in a context that the FBI's filing described as surveillance conducted with intent to intimidate a federal witness. Kevin Fallow, the congressional staffer, was charged separately. Unauthorized access to classified records, conspiracy, and misuse of federal contracting resources. His attorney, unlike Voss's, did not immediately signal cooperation. He would get there eventually. They usually did. Pamela Griggs was not charged on Thursday. Her situation was more complicated. Her connection to the procurement network was less direct, mediated through Holt, and the federal prosecutors were being deliberate about what they could prove versus what they suspected. She resigned her position permanently 2 days after the charges were filed in a letter to the board that was 2 sentences long and contained no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, which was the kind of exit that satisfied no one, but was sometimes the only kind available when the alternative was a public statement that would be read by federal prosecutors. Congressman Warren Daley gave a press conference on Thursday afternoon. He stood at a podium in his district office in Denver and said that he had been unaware of his staffers' actions, that he took full responsibility for the culture of his office, and that he would cooperate fully with any investigation. He was flanked by 2 other staffers who looked like they were calculating how long they had to remain at their current jobs. Whether Daley himself would face charges was a question that federal prosecutors declined to answer publicly, which was itself an answer of a kind. The investigation into his office's connection to the Meridian Network was ongoing. The word ongoing in federal investigation contexts had a specific duration that was measured in months, not days. And the word had been used by DOJ with the particular deliberateness of people who were building something they intended to finish. Colt told Mara about the charges by phone. He read her each count against each defendant in the flat, precise voice of a man delivering a factual account. When he finished, she asked one question. The classified records access charge against Voss, does that fully cover what was accessed? Yes. The charge is specific to the unauthorized use of a defense contractor credential to access protected personnel records. It's in the filing. Thank you.
Ms. Delaney. He paused in a way that was different from his professional pauses. You should know that the evidence timeline the prosecutors built, the foundation of it, starts with the incident reports filed Tuesday morning and the medication interaction notation in Gould's chart and the notebook entries you handed me. Every other thread we pulled was pulled because those things gave us the geometry to know where to look. Another pause. You did good work.
She almost said something deflecting. It was the instinct, the one she'd been operating on since she'd learned that calling attention to what you'd done was a liability in the settings where she'd done the things most worth calling attention to. Instead, she said, "So did you." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "See you at the evidentiary hearing." Raymond Gould was discharged from Creekside Valley Medical Center on a Friday morning, 11 days after he'd arrived by ambulance with a failing heart and a pacemaker that had been trying and losing. He walked out under his own power, which was not a given when he'd arrived, and which his cardiologist described as a better outcome than she'd initially projected. Carol was with him. She had the look of someone who had spent 11 days operating on the specific energy reserve that spouses of hospitalized people developed. Not exactly stress and not exactly calm, but a third thing that was both of them compressed into functionality. She looked like she could sleep for a week, and also like she was going to have a lot to say to him once he was home. Mara was in the lobby. She had been reinstated 2 days earlier. The amended offer document had arrived the same afternoon as promised. Patricia had reviewed it that evening and called with approval, and Mara had signed it the following morning in Patricia's office while Patricia made bad instant coffee and said nothing unnecessarily, which was one of the things Mara had come to appreciate about her. She had not yet returned to the trauma floor. She was taking 2 days before resuming clinical duties, not because anyone had required it, but because she had learned, in other contexts, that the gap between a sustained high-pressure situation and the return to ordinary work required acknowledgement, not processing in the therapeutic sense. Just acknowledgement. The recognition that something significant had happened, and that you were not the same configuration of person you were before it, and that the ordinary work would require you to show up as the configuration you now were, rather than the one you'd been. She was in the lobby because Carol had sent her a message the previous evening. Ray wants to say goodbye before we leave. He said to tell you he won't make a scene, but he can't leave without it. She saw them coming through the corridor from the elevator. Gould moving carefully, the deliberate pace of a man whose body had recently been through surgery and was negotiating the terms of re-entry into the ordinary world. He was wearing civilian clothes, which made him look both more and less familiar than the version of him she knew from the Bay, which was the version she'd seen horizontal and monitored and fighting his own physiology. He saw her and slowed. Carol touched his arm and then gave them space in the particular way of someone who understood that certain exchanges didn't need an audience. He stopped in front of her. He was taller than she'd registered. The hospital bed had compressed him somehow. He had the straight-backed posture of someone who'd carried it long enough that it was simply the shape of his spine now. "I heard what they did to you," he said. "I heard what happened to your complaint," she said. A pause. 14 months. You kept pushing anyway. Not very effectively. Effectively enough, she said. You filed it. You documented it. You told the truth in a system that was built to make telling the truth inconvenient. She looked at him steadily. That's not nothing, Mr. Gould. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had spent 64 years being assessed by people and who was conducting his own assessment now. Carol told me about your service. Some of it's public now. Some of it. Yes. He nodded slowly. I spent 3 years attached to audit and oversight. I know what classified means. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I know what it means to work somewhere that the work can't be talked about. And I know what it does to you when you come out the other side of that, and nobody knows what you've been carrying. She didn't say anything to that, because there was nothing to say that improved on what he'd said. You saved my life twice, he said. Once in that bay, and once... He stopped. Once by being the kind of person who notices things and writes them down and doesn't quit when someone in a suit tells you to. I almost didn't go back in, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it, which was unusual for her. When I heard the monitor, for about 2 seconds, I almost didn't. He looked at her. I'd just been fired, she said. In a corridor, in front of people I'd worked with for 4 years. And for about 2 seconds I thought, Mish, that's not my patient anymore. That's not my problem. Let them handle it. What happened to the 2 seconds? They ended, she said. And then I went in. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's the part they don't tell you about being good at something. It's not that you don't hesitate. It's that you hesitate and then you do it anyway. Carol appeared at his elbow, not intrusively, just present. We should get moving before he decides he wants another 3 days in there. Gould made a sound that was his version of a laugh. He held out his hand. Mara shook it, a real handshake, not the careful version, the kind that communicated something through the grip. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, he said. And Delaney. He said her name the way people said names when they intended the person to hear it. Don't let them make you quiet about this. What happened here, it happened somewhere else too. Same network, different building. There are other Goulds in other waiting rooms who don't know yet what's running underneath. She knew that. Colt had told her the investigation had expanded to 4 other hospital systems. She knew that the notebook entries and the incident reports and the proffer testimony were going to generate federal oversight reviews at each of those facilities, that procurement audits were already scheduled, that the scope of what had been operating under the Meridian umbrella was larger than any single termination or any single patient or any single Tuesday morning. I know, she said. He nodded, let go of her hand, turned with Carol and walked toward the lobby exit into the outdoor air of Harlan Falls, into the ordinary world that had very nearly lost him. The public acknowledgement was released by Creekside Valley's communications office the following Monday. It went out through the hospital's official channels and was picked up by 3 regional news outlets by noon. The text was almost exactly what Mara had read in Vreeland's conference room, with minor edits. Her name was in the 2nd paragraph. The 3rd paragraph described the policy amendment and its submission to the state health authority. The local television affiliate ran a segment that evening. They used a photograph of the hospital exterior and a stock image of a medical setting, which was fine. The reporter described the situation accurately and without embellishment, which was all anyone could ask. The segment was 4 minutes long. Her phone had more messages than she'd ever received at once. Nurses from Creekside. People she hadn't spoken to in years. Patricia Odom with a single line. This is what accountability looks like when it's done correctly. Marcus Webb sent a message that said, "Saw the news. Your old CO sends his regards. He said you'd understand what that means." She understood what it meant. It meant the people who knew what was in her file were watching, and they were not embarrassed by what they saw. That was not a small thing to know. Donna Reyes called at 8 o'clock that evening. Not to talk about the news segment, or the acknowledgement, or the charges, or any of it. She called to say that Raymond Gould's cardiologist had filed a formal complaint with the VA about the mishandled review, and that the VA's patient advocacy office had confirmed it was being reopened under a different reviewer, and that Preston Mays had received notification that his probationary review would be conducted by an external evaluator from the state nursing board. He was terrified, Donna said. When he came to me, he was genuinely scared. I know. He didn't have to come to me. No, Mara said. He didn't. He's 29 months out of nursing school, and he walked into my office instead of signing that form. Donna's voice had the quality of someone who was turning something over, examining it. I've been doing this for 22 years, and sometimes it's a third-year nurse who... She stopped. Never mind, I'm being sentimental. You're not, Mara said. He made the hard call. That's not sentiment, that's the whole thing. A silence. Then Donna said, "Come back soon. The morning shift is a disaster without you." 2 days. 2 days, Donna repeated with the tone of someone logging it. The State Health Authority formally adopted the Patient Care Protection Amendment as a recommended standard for all hospital systems in Colorado 43 days after Creekside's board submitted it. The adoption was not automatic. It required a review period, a public comment window, and a formal vote by the authority's governing panel. But it moved faster than these things usually moved, because the federal investigation provided a context that made the authority's deliberations feel less abstract. Mara testified at the evidentiary hearing in Denver 5 weeks after the charges were filed. She sat in a federal courtroom, not at a witness stand in a trial, because the cases hadn't reached trial yet, but in a preliminary evidentiary proceeding that was part of the charging record, and answered questions from a federal prosecutor for 40 minutes. The prosecutor's questions were methodical. She answered them the same way. The courtroom was not full. These proceedings rarely drew crowds, but there were people in the gallery, a handful of journalists, someone from the VA's advocacy office, 2 nurses from Creekside who had asked Mara if they could come, and she'd said yes. She was asked about Tuesday morning, about the sequence of events in the corridor, about her return to the trauma bay, about the medication interaction, about the notebook entries. She answered every question with the same precision she brought to everything, and she did not editorialize, and she did not perform anything, and she did not try to make it sound like more than it was, which was a person doing a job they were trained to do in circumstances that made it harder than it should have been. When the prosecutor asked why she had returned to the bay after being terminated, she gave the same answer she'd given in Colt's office, the same answer she'd given Gould in the hospital lobby. I heard the monitor change, she said, and I knew what it meant, and I went back in. Even though you'd been fired minutes before? Yes. Why? She looked at the prosecutor. Because the reason I was fired was that I refused to put a patient in danger. Going back in was the same decision, just the next version of it. The courtroom was quiet. Nothing further, the prosecutor said. Bernard Holt pleaded guilty 11 weeks after the charges were filed. The plea agreement was comprehensive: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, retaliation. His sentencing was scheduled for the following spring. His attorney released a statement that described his client as accepting responsibility and cooperating fully, which was accurate in the narrow sense that he had cooperated once cooperation became the only viable option. Leonard Voss entered a guilty plea 2 weeks later. His sentence, when it came, would be shaped by the scope of his cooperation, which had been extensive. The insurance he'd built, the recordings, the financial records, the careful parallel documentation, had served its intended purpose, which was to be worth something when everything else collapsed. It would buy him something. Not enough, but something. Kevin Fallow cooperated. It took 6 weeks and a second round of charges, but he cooperated. And what he provided about the internal workings of Daly's office was, according to Colt, the kind of material that took a complex investigation and turned it into a straightforward one. Congressman Warren Daly announced, on a Wednesday afternoon with no advance notice, that he would not seek re-election. The announcement was careful. Health reasons, family considerations, a desire to spend time outside public service. It was the announcement that politicians made when they had been told clearly, by people whose opinions they could not ignore, that continuation was no longer viable. He was not charged. Not yet. Whether that would change depended on the direction Fallow's testimony ultimately pointed and the degree to which DOJ was willing to build the case the long way. Colt, when Mara asked him about it, said only, "These things take time, but they don't disappear." She accepted that. She had learned, in settings considerably more extreme than this one, that justice rarely arrived on the schedule you wanted it on. What mattered was that it was moving. 3 months after Tuesday morning, Mara stood in the trauma bay at Creekside Valley and ran through a standard shift handoff with the outgoing nurse. The bay looked the way it always looked. The equipment, the monitor positions, the supply layout she'd memorized so thoroughly that she could navigate it in poor lighting, which she had done more than once. The hospital felt different in ways that were hard to articulate, but that were real. The interim administrator, a woman named Frances Cho, who had run a hospital system in New Mexico for 8 years before taking this position, moved through the building with a transparency that the previous administration had never had. Her door was actually open. Her schedule was actually posted. And when she walked the clinical floors, she asked nurses questions and listened to the answers rather than delivering information at them. It wasn't a perfect institution. No institution was. The supply chain issues that had nothing to do with Meridian were still supply chain issues. The staffing pressures that had been building before any of this started had not resolved because a COO had resigned. The impossible math of healthcare, the gap between what was needed and what was funded, between what patients required and what systems could provide, remained exactly as impossible as it had always been. But the policy amendment was on the wall of the break room. Posted by someone, Mara didn't know who, in the same place where the shift schedules and the continuing education announcements lived. It had been there when she came back. She'd read it once and then gotten on with her shift, which was the only appropriate response. The call from Marcus Webb came on a Thursday evening 4 months after the charges. "I have something to pass along," he said. "From the Defense Coordination Office, through the right channels. It's an offer." She was at her kitchen table with the older notebook open, the one with the equipment entries which she'd gotten back from the Federal Evidence Office the previous week, with a chain of custody notation stamped on the cover. She'd been thinking about what to do with it, whether to keep it or whether keeping it was the wrong kind of attachment to what it represented. "What kind of offer?" she said. "The DoD, in coordination with the VA and HHS, is establishing a joint oversight position. Veterans' healthcare quality in civilian facilities, specifically the interface between VA-referred patients and institutional systems. The role involves audit capacity, clinical standards review, and the ability to flag procurement irregularities that affect care quality." He paused. "It's a new position. They built it in response to what this investigation uncovered. The person who takes it will have federal investigative support and state licensing authority access and the ability to operate across facility lines." Mara looked at the notebook. "They want someone with clinical credibility," Webb continued, "medical background, audit sensibility, and a demonstrated willingness to act on what they observe even when it costs them something." "Marcus, I'm just passing the message. They're describing me." "They built the description around you, yes. The position doesn't exist yet. It exists because of what happened at Creekside." A pause. "It would mean leaving the floor." She thought about that, about what leaving the floor meant. The monitor sounds she could interpret from 30 feet away, the specific texture of active clinical work, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 shifts worth of pattern recognition. She had spent 7 years doing something she could not name in public, and 4 years building something she could, and neither of those things was minor or replaceable. But she thought about what Gould had said in the lobby. Don't let them make you quiet about this. There are other Goulds in other waiting rooms, and she thought about what the offer actually was, stripped of the institutional language, an official mechanism to do what she'd been doing anyway. To notice things and write them down and act on what she found, not alone, not after the fact, not at the cost of her own employment, but with the authority to make it count before someone ended up on a table with a compromised pacemaker because a COO was managing a procurement relationship. "What's the timeline?" she said. "They want an answer in 2 weeks. The position would start in 90 days. I want to read the full scope document before I agree to anything." "Understood. I'll send it tonight." She looked at the notebook one more time. Then she closed it. "Webb," she said, "the commendation from the Military Ethics Review, the one that found every decision I made was within or above standard. Is that part of the public record now?" "It was entered into the federal evidentiary record during the preliminary hearing, which means it's accessible." "Good," she said. "That's good." She ended the call, sat at the table. The kitchen was quiet in the way her apartment was quiet in the evenings. Not empty, just settled. Outside, the city of Harlan Falls was running its ordinary operations, its buses and streetlights, and the particular sounds of a place that didn't know it had been at the center of something. She thought about what it would mean to take the position. Not the logistics, those were solvable, but the actual meaning of it, the thing it would make her professionally and otherwise. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life being the person who knew more than the official record showed, the person whose capabilities exceeded her visible credentials, the person who worked in the gap between what institutions acknowledged and what they actually needed. That had been, for the most part, the design, in her service years because classification required it, in her nursing years because she had chosen a quieter version of herself and found it livable. What the offer was, essentially, was an end to the gap, a role in which what she knew and what she was authorized to act on would be the same thing, where the person she had been and the person she was operating as would not have to be managed separately. She was not naive about what that would cost. Official authority came with official accountability, official visibility, official pressure from official directions. She had worked in settings where oversight was institutional and imperfect and sometimes actively hostile to the work it was nominally supporting. She knew that a federal oversight position did not mean a frictionless path to correct outcomes. But she also knew that the alternative, what the previous 4 years had been, what Tuesday morning had been, was its own kind of cost. Invisible work with invisible authority and visible consequences when the work ran up against the interests of visible people. Gould had filed a complaint, and it had been closed by a compromised reviewer. She had written in a notebook, and it had sat in a kitchen drawer. Both of those things, in isolation, had looked like nothing. Together, they had been the foundation of a federal investigation that had reached a congressman's office and a state regulatory body and a network worth millions of dollars. The question was what they could have been if either of them had had the structure to make them matter in real time. She already knew the answer. She called Francis Cho the next morning. The interim administrator picked up on the second ring, which was the kind of thing that communicated something about how she ran an institution. "I want to tell you about an offer I received," Mara said. "Before I make a decision, I think you should know." Cho listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, there was a brief silence. "How long would we have you?" 90 days, if I accept. I'd want to use part of that time doing something specific here before I leave." "What kind of specific?" "I want to do a complete audit of our equipment rotation and supply chain documentation going back 3 years, with your support and access. I want to establish what the baseline should look like so that whoever comes after me on the clinical side has something to compare against." A pause. "You'd be doing our work on your own time." "It's not your work," Mara said. "It's the patient's work. And 90 days is enough time to do it properly." Cho was quiet for a moment. "All right, you'll have full access. And Delaney," she paused in the way people paused when they were deciding to say something real rather than something appropriate. "The board's public statement said that your actions set the standard the new policy is designed to protect. I want you to know that I read that statement, and I read your personnel file, and I read the evidentiary record that's been made public, and what I came away thinking was..." She stopped. "The system you worked in failed you systematically before it failed catastrophically. You held the standard when the system didn't. That's the part I want the institution to understand going forward, not just the policy, the reason for it. Mara looked out her kitchen window. The mountains were clear today, which they weren't always. The kind of clear that happened after a cold night when the air was stripped of everything that usually softened the edges. "I'll make sure they understand," she said. She signed the offer document 2 weeks later. 90 days before the start date, she worked the floor at Creekside Valley for the last time as a floor nurse. Not with ceremony, not with announcement, just with the same methodical attention to the same patients and the same monitors and the same accumulated knowledge of how this particular bay worked at 7 in the morning when the light came through the window at the specific angle that meant the monitor screen washed out slightly and you had to adjust your position to read it. The audit she completed in the final 3 weeks was thorough and documented and handed to Francis Cho in a binder that Cho's new clinical operations manager could use as a baseline and a checklist and a record of what the Meridian equipment rotation had displaced. It would never be a dramatic document, but it would be there, permanent and referenced, doing the quiet work that quiet documents did. On her last shift, Raymond Gould called the nurses' station. He'd gotten the number, he said, from Carol, who'd gotten it from the hospital's general information line, which meant he'd made at least 2 calls to achieve it, which was the kind of effort that said something about a man. The nurse who answered the call came to find Mara in Bay 2, where she was running through the same supply inventory she'd been running through on Tuesday morning 4 months ago. "There's a call for you," the nurse said. "He says his name is Gould. He says he heard you're leaving and he wanted to say something before you did." She picked up the extension at the nurse's station, the same station where she'd retrieved her badge and her notepad the morning she'd been fired. The same linoleum, the same light, the same hospital sounds underneath everything. "Mr. Gould, I heard you're taking a federal position." His voice was stronger than it had been in the hospital. The voice of a man whose pacemaker was working the way pacemakers were supposed to work. "Where did you hear that?" "My wife reads the local news obsessively since all of this happened. She may have developed a specific interest in anything involving your name." Mara made a sound that was her version of a laugh. "Tell her I appreciate it. She'll be pleased." A pause. "I want to say one thing, and then I'll let you get back to it." "Go ahead." "You told me in the lobby that you hesitated. For 2 seconds, when you heard the monitor. You told me you almost didn't go back in." "I remember. I've been thinking about that." His voice was measured, the voice of a man who had spent 4 months doing the same thing she'd been doing, turning the event over, looking at it from different angles, understanding it in the context of everything that came after. "I've been thinking about what it means that a person with your background, your training, your history, that you hesitated." She waited. "It means you chose," he said. "Not instinct, not training. You chose. The hesitation is the proof of it. 2 seconds where you could have walked away, and you didn't, and nobody could have blamed you if you had." He paused. "I want you to know that I think about those 2 seconds, because I know what it costs to walk back into something when you've already been pushed out. I know the specific weight of it, and you did it anyway, not because you had to, because you decided to." The nurse's station was quiet around her. Down the corridor, someone was running a monitoring check in Bay 3, the low regular sound of equipment going through its paces. "Thank you," she said, "for calling." "Take care of my people," he said, "the ones in the waiting rooms who don't know yet." "That's the job," she said, and she meant it in the most complete sense. Not as a reassurance, not as a professional commitment, but as the most honest description of what she understood herself to be now. The gap between what she'd been and what she was authorized to act on had closed. The person she'd been carrying all these years, through the classified years and the quiet years, and the Tuesday morning that changed the geometry of everything, that person and this person were finally the same. The nurses who had watched her fired in a corridor had watched her reinstated by a federal investigation and a unanimous board vote, and a policy that now bore her actions as its stated reason. The patient they had tried to move had survived to file a corrected complaint. The documents that had been built to destroy her had been entered into a federal record that established the opposite. The network that had operated in the space between what institutions said and what they did had been pulled into the light, named, charged, and mapped across 4 hospital systems and 1 congressional office. None of it was clean. None of it was finished in the way that meant there was nothing left to do. The follow-on investigation into Daly's office was ongoing. The sentencing hearings were months away. The 4 other hospital systems were mid-audit. The work that she was stepping into on the other side of the 90 days was the hardest kind. The kind that happened before the crisis, in the ordinary operations of institutions that didn't yet know they were compromised, in the paperwork and the procurement records, and the notebook entries that nobody read until they needed to. But she had learned something in the years before this and in the 4 months since that she had not fully understood when she started. The quiet work was the real work, not the dramatic intervention in a trauma bay. That was necessary, and she would do it again without hesitation, but the noticing, the documentation, the stubborn refusal to let the gap between what was right and what was happening go unrecorded, even when no one was watching, even when it seemed to matter to no one. That was the discipline that had made Tuesday morning possible. Not her service background, not the specific skills she'd carried out of the years she couldn't name. Those had helped. They'd been the mechanism. But the mechanism was housed in something older and less dramatic. A habit of paying attention and writing it down and not talking yourself out of what you'd seen just because the people around you hadn't seen it. You could fire a person for that. You could fabricate documentation against them and access their classified records and send a networked official to sit outside their building. You could do all of that and more, and the person could still come back through the door of Trauma Bay 2 with their gloves on because the monitor had changed pitch and they'd heard it from 30 feet away through a wall. And then what you'd built over years with millions of dollars and political relationships and the careful management of every visible surface, all of it would start coming down, one documented fact at a time, because the person you had underestimated turned out to be exactly the kind of person who kept records. The hospital was still running its morning operations around her when she hung up the phone. Monitors and carts, and the PA system, and the light coming through the window at the angle that washed out the screens if you weren't positioned correctly. She knew how to position correctly. She picked up her clipboard, went back to work. Some people are dismissed because they are quiet. Some are dismissed because the people dismissing them need them to be smaller than they are. And some are dismissed because someone, somewhere, already knew what they were capable of and decided that capability was dangerous. The ones who come back are not the ones who shout the loudest or fight the hardest in the way that gets noticed. They are the ones who keep the record, who notice the thing that seems small, who refuse at the moment when refusal is most costly to sign the form. They are the ones who go back through the door. And in doing so, they change what the door means. Not just for themselves, but for every person who will one day stand in a corridor, in a hospital, in an institution of any kind, and be told that the correct thing to do is to walk away. The story of what happens when they don't is always the same story, and it never gets old.